The Appalachian Trail in early March, right after an ice storm, is no joke. We learned that the hard way. It was supposed to be a relatively straightforward trip. Just a section hike, nothing crazy. Me and my two buddies, all of us 21 and in decent shape, planned for a weekend in the wilderness. The forecast predicted mid-40s, a solid temperature for a good hike. The storm had hit a week prior, but we figured that would be enough time for conditions to improve. We were wrong. The first few miles were manageable. The snow was packed down in some areas, but still loose enough in others that every few steps we would sink in about half a foot. Annoying, but nothing we couldn't handle. The trail twisted through the leafless forest, the sun cutting through the bare branches, reflecting off the white powder in a way that made it feel almost peaceful. If anything, it gave us a false sense of confidence. Then we hit the deeper snow. Knee-deep at first, then waist-deep in some spots, with a thick layer of ice crusting the top. Every step was a battle. We had to lift our legs high just to take another step forward, and half the time, the ice would break under our weight, sending us crashing through the surface. There was no rhythm, no way to move efficiently. Each step required strength we didn't realize we would need. Our plan had been to check the mile markers and reassess the situation if it got too difficult. But we never saw the next marker. It was buried under feet of snow. By the time we had slogged through 2 more miles of the icy mess, we had passed the point of no return. Turning back was just as daunting as pushing forward. The map told us we should be only a mile away from a shelter. That knowledge was the only thing keeping us going. What the map hadn't shown, however, was that the shelter was actually another mile off the main trail. That realization didn't hit us until much later, when we were already beyond exhaustion. The sun was sinking, and our legs were barely functioning. My calves were locking up, my thighs seizing with every step. My friends weren't doing much better. Each time one of us had to stop to stretch out a cramp, it got harder to start moving again. But stopping for too long wasn't an option. The cold would creep in fast, and without tents, we had no choice but to make it to that shelter. The last stretch felt impossible. The snow swallowed our feet with every step, and the ice made everything unpredictable. Sometimes it would hold our weight, other times it would crack, sending us plunging into the deep snow beneath. My hamstrings cramped so badly, I had to stop and force my legs to extend before I could take another step. It was hell. We made it to the shelter just before sunset. I don't even remember the last 100 yards. It was a blur of pain and exhaustion. My legs were trembling as I dropped my pack inside. My buddies collapsed onto the wooden floor, panting like we'd just run a marathon. We needed water, and we needed a fire, but neither task felt doable. The water pump, which should have been a quick and easy source, was barely functional. Every step toward it sent a jolt of pain through my legs. My hands were shaking as I worked the handle, and it took what felt like forever to fill our bottles. The fire was worse. Our bodies screamed with every movement, but we had to get something going. The air was rapidly cooling now that the sun was down. We managed to scrape together enough dry kindling, but our fingers were stiff, and every attempt to light the fire felt like it was happening in slow motion. Finally, after several failed attempts, the flame caught. It was small, weak, but it was something. That night was agony. Our muscles were fried. Every shift in position sent cramps surging through our legs. I could barely stretch my legs out without them locking up. Sleep came in brief, miserable stretches. The temperature dipped lower than expected, and despite our layers, the cold seeped into our bones. By morning, we were in bad shape. My calves felt like they had been torn apart. My thighs were no better. Moving at all sent a wave of pain through my entire body. My friends were in the same condition. We sat in silence, knowing we were in trouble. Then, the forecast changed. Freezing rain was supposed to start by noon. 7 miles still separated us from the nearest trailhead. There was no way we were making it out in our current state. Even if we pushed through the pain, the ice storm would turn the trail into a death trap. We had no choice but to call for help. None of us wanted to do it, but there was no alternative. With barely functioning legs and worsening conditions, waiting for a ranger was the only option. It took time, but eventually they got to us. They weren't thrilled about it, but they understood. When they saw the condition of the trail, they admitted it was worse than expected. The ride back felt like defeat, but at least we were safe. It had been a brutal lesson. We had underestimated the ice, the snow, and the trail itself. The mountain didn't care how fit we were or how prepared we thought we had been. We got lucky. It could have ended much worse. The The next few days were spent recovering, our legs barely functioning. Every movement was a reminder of how bad it had been. But even now, looking back, the biggest takeaway is simple: respect the trail. Snow and ice change everything. If there's been an ice storm recently, be very, very cautious. And never assume the conditions are as easy as they look on paper. It was late October, and I was out on a solo hike in the East Tennessee backcountry, deep in a stretch of private land owned by a rich friend of mine. His property bordered the national park, and he had told me I was free to roam wherever I wanted. I had been hiking all day, completely off-trail, just meandering through the thick woods, following ridgelines and cutting through narrow hollows. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't run into another soul unless they were deliberately looking for you. That's exactly what I liked about it. The air had a crisp edge to it, the kind that signaled winter wasn't too far off. The leaves had mostly changed, brilliant reds and deep oranges hanging onto the branches, while a thick carpet of brown covered the forest floor. The sun had been setting earlier and earlier, and by the time I decided to set up camp, it was already dark. I picked a flat spot near a small clearing, cleared the area of loose leaves, and got a small fire going. Just enough to keep the chill off, nothing too bright. After setting up my small tent and making sure my gear was in order, I sat back against a fallen log, packed a bowl, and let my mind drift. It was one of those moments where everything just felt right. The fire crackled softly, the air was cool but not uncomfortably so, and the woods were alive with their usual nighttime sounds. Distant hoots from an owl, the rustling of small critters in the brush, the occasional creak of branches shifting in the wind. I don't know how long I had been sitting there, fully relaxed, deep in a kind of meditation, when the first scream ripped through the night. It was loud, unbelievably loud. A high-pitched, guttural, furious scream, somewhere between a wild animal and something entirely unnatural. And it was close, real close. My eyes snapped open, my body locked in place. I hadn't moved an inch, but my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sound had come from directly across the fire, maybe 30 feet away. For a few seconds, I couldn't do anything but sit there, frozen, every hair on my body standing on end. I wasn't sure if I had even been breathing. My first thought wasn't to run or yell, it was just pure, blind terror. My mind struggled to process what I had just heard. Then it screamed again. That snapped me out of my paralysis. I didn't move suddenly, some deep, primal instinct told me not to. Instead, I slowly reached down and unzipped my pack, pulling out my 9mm. I kept it low, resting on the ground beside me, while my other hand reached for more sticks to feed the fire. I had been keeping it small on purpose, but now I didn't care. I tossed everything I could reach into it, watching as the flames leapt higher, casting more light into the surrounding trees. I sat completely still, my gun resting in my lap, waiting. My eyes scanned the woods beyond the fire, but I couldn't see anything. The screaming had stopped. I listened, really listened, but all I could hear now was the crackling fire and my own breathing. Then, maybe 5 minutes later, another scream, this time from my left, much further away. I kept sitting, unmoving, still gripping the gun in my lap. Another 5 minutes passed, and I heard it again, even further out. It was moving away from me. The fear slowly started to fade, replaced by curiosity. What the hell had just screamed at me? I ran through a mental list of everything it could be: fox, bobcat, coyote. But none of those quite matched what I had heard. And then it hit me. A screech owl. I exhaled, feeling both relief and embarrassment wash over me. It had to be a damn screech owl. I'd heard them before, but never that close, and never while sitting alone in the dark after getting stoned. The relief didn't come all at once, though. My nerves were still shot, my body still keyed up. I kept the fire going a little longer than usual, just to be sure, before finally crawling into my tent. Even after I lay down, my heart took a while to slow. The adrenaline had been dumped into my system hard, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. Every little sound outside had me alert, listening. But nothing else happened that night. Eventually, I fell into a light, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up stiff and exhausted. I packed up my gear, put out the fire completely, and started hiking again. The daylight made everything feel different, safer. It was funny how something could feel so terrifying at night, but seem so stupid in the morning. A damn owl. I shook my head, half laughing at myself as I walked. But the hike wasn't over yet. Sometime in the afternoon, I was walking through a dense patch of mountain laurel when I spotted something through the gaps in the branches. A person. Another hiker. My stomach dropped. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something different, an uneasy, sinking feeling. I was miles from anywhere, on land that wasn't open to the public, completely off trail. Whoever they were, they shouldn't have been here. And worse, they hadn't seen me yet. I dropped low, crouching behind the laurel. I watched them for a moment, trying to gauge whether they were just passing through or if they were looking for something, or someone. They moved slowly, looking around, adjusting their pack. It didn't seem like they were lost, and they weren't acting suspicious. Maybe just another guy who had wandered too far past the park boundary. Still, I didn't want to be seen. I waited until they moved on, staying perfectly still, barely breathing. Once they were out of sight, I waited another 10 minutes just to be safe before moving again. I took a different route back, circling wide to avoid running into them. When I finally made it back to my truck, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and locked the doors out of habit. Sitting there for a moment, I let out a deep breath and shook my head. A screech owl and another hiker. Two of the scariest things I'd ever encountered alone in the woods. And between the two, I honestly couldn't decide which one had freaked me out more. I spent 3 months in the backcountry of the Talkeetna Mountains in Alaska about 15 years ago. It was one of the most intense, isolating, and humbling experiences of my life. The wilderness up there is vast and unforgiving. Endless stretches of tundra, towering peaks, and thick forests, all hiding creatures that could kill you in an instant. The mountains were wild, and the rivers ran fast and cold. There were no roads, no rangers, no way to call for help if something went wrong. You were on your own. I thought I had prepared for everything, but nothing could have prepared me for that one night. It must have been early July, right in the heart of the season where the sun barely dipped below the horizon. Even at 3 in the morning, it was bright enough outside that you could see the outline of the mountains in the distance. That night, I had gone to sleep in my tent with 3 other guys, exhausted from a long day of hiking and setting up camp. Our group had settled in a valley, surrounded by rolling hills covered in thick brush. We had seen bear tracks earlier that week, but no actual signs of one close to camp. We had been careful, hung our food properly, cooked away from the tents, and did everything by the book. But none of that mattered when I woke up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding out of my chest, panic flooding every inch of my body. There was no sound, no reason I should have woken up. I wasn't having a nightmare. I had just jolted awake into raw, unfiltered terror. My body felt locked in place, my breathing sharp and shallow. It was like my instincts knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. Then I heard it, a deep, slow exhale, the unmistakable sound of something massive breathing just outside the thin fabric of my tent. My eyes darted around, barely able to make out the shapes of my 3 tent mates, all still sound asleep. My pulse hammered so hard I thought it might shake the tent. I turned my head slowly, staring at the wall of the tent closest to me. The light from the midnight sun cast a dim, ghostly glow through the nylon fabric, just enough to reveal a massive shadow pressed against the side of our shelter. The shape was unmistakable, broad shoulders, thick neck, long snout. A grizzly, a behemoth of an animal, its sheer size overwhelming even in shadow. I could see the way it moved, slow, deliberate, sniffing. It let out another breath, a strange mix of a huff and a grunt, the sound so deep I felt it in my chest. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. My body had gone cold, locked in that primal, helpless fear. The kind of fear that makes you feel like prey. I knew running was useless. If I bolted, it would be over in seconds. Screaming wasn't an option either. I was trapped in a fragile sheet of fabric with 3 other people, and none of us stood a chance if this thing decided to come crashing through. It pawed at the tent, pressing its weight gently against the fabric, as if testing it. The nylon flexed, bowing inward, and I held my breath, convinced that any second, those massive claws would tear through and pull me out. It huffed again, the sound carrying weight, vibrating through the air. Then it started circling. I heard the crunch of its paws in the dirt, the heavy shift of its body moving around us. Each step was deliberate, slow. It was curious, maybe hungry, maybe just investigating. But curiosity alone from an animal that big was enough to kill. My fingers dug into my sleeping bag, my breathing shallow, barely daring to move. I thought about the stories, people being dragged from their tents, mauled, their bodies found torn apart in the brush. The stories were always brutal. A grizzly wasn't just a predator. It was a force of nature. The bear stopped moving. The breathing stayed close. It sat, just sat, right next to the tent, and time stretched. It could have been 10 minutes. Could have been an hour. I didn't know. It felt like eternity. My mind raced through scenarios, but every single one ended the same way, with me dead. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, every muscle in my body stiff with tension. My mouth was dry, my tongue stuck to the roof. It was so close, too close. Then, finally, it rose to its feet. It sniffed again, a deep, heavy inhale, as if memorizing our scent. And then, just like that, it walked away. I didn't breathe until the sound of its footsteps faded. Even then, I stayed frozen, my muscles locked, my body still refusing to move. I wanted to wake the others, to make sure I hadn't imagined it, but I was afraid. Afraid that any movement might bring it back. I lay there, listening. The bear had moved toward the other tents. I heard more sniffing, more huffing. The same slow, careful steps. A part of me felt ashamed for thinking it, but I was relieved. Relieved that if something happened now, it wouldn't be me. But nothing happened. Eventually, it just left. Vanished back into the wilderness, slipping away as silently as it had come. When morning finally came, I crawled out of my tent, my body sore and exhausted. The others stirred awake, stretching, yawning, completely unaware of what had happened. I stepped out into the cold morning air, my breath visible in the light. And then I saw them. Massive paw prints. Deep impressions in the mud, circling the tent. Huge, clawed tracks leading away toward the brush. My stomach turned. Seeing the evidence of it, knowing just how real it had been, sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I looked around at the others, still groggy, rubbing their eyes. They had no idea how close we had come to disaster. I thought about telling them, but what would I say? That death had sat outside our tent last night, breathing, waiting, deciding? I never slept the same after that. Not in the backcountry. Not with those mountains around me, the rivers whispering, the endless stretch of untamed land hiding things bigger, stronger, faster. Somewhere out there, that grizzly still walks. And it remembers. We had just finished our shifts at Sleeping Giant Provincial Park, exhausted, but excited for some solitude. After spending weeks surrounded by over a dozen other staff members, my coworker and I decided to skip the staff party and take a backcountry camping trip. Just a few days, just us, the wilderness, and some peace and quiet. We were so eager for it that we sang as we hiked, our voices echoing through the trees. The hike was long, but we didn't mind. It took about 3 hours to reach our first campsite. The forest was thick, but the air smelled fresh, and our packs, heavy at first, became more bearable as we adjusted to the weight. The occasional mosquito buzzed around us, but we barely noticed. We had bug spray. We were prepared. When we finally arrived at our site, the first thing we heard was shouting from the lake. A couple was already there, and they were frantic. We couldn't make out their words at first, just the urgent tone of their voices. We walked closer, trying to understand what was going on. Then we heard it clearly. "It's okay if you freak out." The man's voice was desperate. "Just run," the woman screamed. I turned to my friend, confused, but before I could say a word, I saw it. Her neon green shirt was nearly black under a thick, shifting mass. Flies. I barely had time to process what I was looking at before I felt them on me too. My arms, my neck, my scalp. I looked down, and my skin was gone, replaced by a writhing, biting swarm. Panic took over. We dropped our packs and bolted for the lake. My boots pounded the ground, the buzzing filling my ears, my body on fire with thousands of tiny bites. My skin crawled with the sensation of their tiny legs clinging to me. Lake Superior is famously cold, but when we dove in, the water was warm. Or maybe I was too numb to feel the cold. For a moment, I thought we were safe. But then I felt them still clinging to me, biting, even underwater. We had to scrape them off with our hands, peeling away the stubborn ones that refused to let go even as they drowned. They died still latched onto us. The couple in the lake with us watched, their faces pale. They had been through it already. We knew the flies weren't leaving anytime soon, so we decided to wait it out. Maybe they would die down as the sun set. Maybe the evening chill would drive them away. As dusk settled, the woman in the couple decided she needed to get out. She hesitated, but finally stepped onto the shore. Within seconds, she was swallowed by the swarm. Her partner panicked, yelling for her to come back to the water. She refused. She had a plan. We watched as she fought her way to the campsite, waving her arms wildly, her face twisted in pain. She grabbed what she needed and managed to start a fire. Smoke billowed up, and the flies backed away. Slowly, she created a bubble of safety around their camp. Her partner finally worked up the courage to leave the lake and join her. We thought we were being smart too. We covered ourselves in thick lake mud, caking it over every inch of exposed skin. If they couldn't reach our skin, they couldn't bite us. Feeling invincible, I told my friend to wait in the water while I went to set up camp. I warned her not to panic, no matter what, because I wouldn't be able to handle it. She promised she wouldn't. She lied. The moment I stepped out of the water, they were on me again. The mud did nothing. Neither did our industrial-strength bug spray. The swarm was relentless. I could feel them crawling into my hair, under my shirt, in the folds of my clothing. I grabbed our bags and ran. I ran blindly, following the trail to the nearest junction, where I knew the flies weren't as bad. The buzzing was deafening. I could feel them wriggling between my fingers as I ran my hands through my hair. Every inch of me was alive with biting, clinging insects. I broke. I started screaming, smacking my own body, trying to kill them. I hate killing bugs. I never wanted to kill anything, but at that moment, all I wanted was for them to stop. I felt like I was losing my mind. I yelled for my friend to stay in the water. She did. I gathered everything, my hands shaking, my skin raw. When I had what we needed, she met me at the trail junction. We couldn't stay there. We couldn't go back. The only choice was to leave. We made dinner right in the middle of the trail, using an illegal fire pit someone else had left behind. We just needed to eat, to regain our strength, to wait and hope the flies would die down. I put on my loose nightshirt, my pajamas, as we ate in silence, our bodies stinging, our nerves frayed. A family passed by, people we had checked in earlier that day. They stopped, looking concerned. "Are you okay?" the father asked. We smiled, nodded. "How was your hike?" I asked. His daughter, maybe 8 years old, pointed at my mud-streaked nightshirt and said, "I like your dress." They moved on. We waited until nearly 11 p.m., but the flies never left. There was no choice. We had to go. So we hiked back, in the dark, through bear and cougar country. Our only defense was singing, loud and off-key, hoping our terrible voices would scare off any predators lurking in the shadows. By the time we made it back to our cabins, it was nearly 2:30 a.m. We stepped inside, exhausted, our skin crusted with dried mud and blood, our hair tangled and half-wet. The party was still going. Everyone was drunk, celebrating the end of the season. We dropped our bags. We grabbed beers. We never spoke about it in detail after that. We laughed it off when people asked why we came back early. But for years, the sound of a fly buzzing near my ear sent my heart racing. I've faced wildlife, injuries, even a bear crashing into my tent, but nothing, not one thing, has ever been as terrifying as those flies. I have always been someone who prefers solitude when hiking. There's something about being alone in the wilderness that makes me feel more connected to it. No distractions, no noise, just me, the trail, and the silence. But that changed on a late autumn afternoon in the Cascade Mountains, when I realized that some silences aren't natural. It started as an ordinary solo hike. I had planned a long but straightforward trek along a remote trail that I had been meaning to explore for a while. It wasn't one of the well-traveled paths with groomed switchbacks and signs at every turn. This was one of those routes you only find if you really go looking, something you might spot on an old Forest Service map or hear about from a seasoned hiker. The trail wound deep into the forest, past towering Douglas firs and dense patches of ferns, following an old logging road before tapering into something less defined. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the remnants of a recent rainstorm still clinging to the underbrush. For the first few miles, everything felt normal, peaceful even. Birds flitted between branches, their calls mixing with the rustling leaves overhead. I kept a steady pace, my boots crunching softly on the damp soil. But as I got deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest started to change. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The birds were still there, the wind still whispered through the trees. But something was off. The usual background hum of insects, the occasional scurrying of small animals, gone. Just an odd, muffled stillness that made my skin prickle. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just a shift in the temperature or a natural quiet spell in the late afternoon. But then I saw him. A man, standing off the trail, partially obscured by the trees. He wasn't a fellow hiker. He wasn't carrying a backpack, and he wasn't dressed for the terrain. He wore a gray hoodie, not waterproof, not insulated for the cold. His jeans were faded, loose-fitting. His shoes were wrong too, black sneakers, worn down, dirty. Not the kind you'd wear for hiking deep into the mountains. He was just standing there. Not moving, not adjusting his stance, not acknowledging me. His posture was unnatural, too rigid, his arms hanging limply at his sides. And the way he was positioned, half behind a tree, not quite hidden but not fully visible, it wasn't normal. I glanced at him quickly, then turned my eyes back to the trail, pretending I hadn't noticed. The last thing I wanted was to make eye contact with someone who might not be mentally stable. I kept walking. My pace quickened slightly, but I forced myself not to run. I told myself he was probably just some guy camping illegally, maybe a drifter passing through. There were all sorts of reasons someone might be in the woods alone. But then, a quarter mile up the trail, I saw him again, standing farther ahead. There was no way, no possible way he could have moved ahead of me without me hearing him running. And I never heard a single footstep. This time, he was closer to the trail, less hidden. Still standing, still watching. A sharp wave of cold ran down my back. I wasn't alone. And whoever this man was, he was playing some kind of game. I kept moving, my heart thudding in my chest. I forced myself to think logically. Maybe there were two of them. Twins, maybe, or just two men dressed the same. It was unlikely, but at least it was an explanation. But my gut knew better. I kept walking. My breathing was faster now, but I controlled it, trying not to let the growing panic take over. I didn't want to look like I was fleeing. Predators, whether animal or human, pick up on fear. I pressed on, keeping my steps steady, my ears straining for movement behind me. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing at all. The unnatural silence of the forest pressed in around me. I turned a bend in the trail, my pulse hammering, and glanced back one last time. He was closer now. Still standing, still watching. I didn't even hear him move. That was the moment I abandoned all pretense of calm. I broke into a run. Not an all-out sprint. I didn't want to burn myself out, but a fast, steady pace. Enough to put distance between us. Enough to get back to a point where there might be other hikers. But the trail was empty. No one else had passed me all day. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded. Every time I glanced back, I expected to see him, but I never did. That was almost worse. The idea that he was still moving, still following, but silent. A sickening thought crept into my mind. What if he wasn't behind me at all? What if he had gone off trail, moving parallel to me, hidden by the trees, keeping pace in absolute silence? I ran faster. I wasn't out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively. At this pace, it would take me at least an hour to reach the trailhead. 60 minutes in the fading daylight, with this thing, this man out there. I thought about stopping, about hiding, but that felt worse. I didn't know where he was, what he wanted. Stopping would make me vulnerable. I had no weapons, no cell service. My only chance was to keep moving. The light was dimming. Shadows stretched across the trail, making every movement in my peripheral vision seem like him. My breath was raw in my throat, my legs burned, but I kept pushing forward. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not loud, not crashing through the brush. Just soft, careful steps. Deliberate. Too close. I didn't look back. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, the cold air stabbing at my lungs. The trail blurred beneath me, my heartbeat drowning out everything else. Then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the trees. Not behind me. Ahead. I skidded to a stop, nearly losing my footing. The figure stepped forward. It was him. Somehow, impossibly, he was in front of me again. This time, he wasn't standing still. He moved. A slow step forward, then another. I did the only thing I could do. I ran off the trail. Straight into the trees, branches whipping against my face, my legs burning as I forced my way through the underbrush. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't let him get closer. I ran blindly, adrenaline overriding every rational thought, until finally, through the thinning trees, I saw something that nearly made me collapse from relief. A road. The logging road that led back to my car. I burst through the tree-line, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. I could see my car parked just up the road. But before I reached it, I forced myself to turn back. The forest was still. Empty. The man was gone. I didn't wait. I threw myself into my car, locked the doors, and sped away. I never went back to that trail. I never told anyone what happened. But even now, I can't stop wondering, if I had hesitated for even a second longer, what would he have done? I never used to be afraid of the woods. Growing up, I spent more nights camping under the stars than I did in my own bed. I loved the solitude, the fresh air, the way the trees whispered when the wind blew through them. That all changed after the night I saw it. The thing that made me question whether we really understand what lurks in the wilderness. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just me and two buddies, Chris and Mark. We chose a spot in West Virginia, miles from the nearest town. A dense forest, full of rocky overhangs and hidden clearings, perfect for getting lost in nature. We packed light, carried only the essentials, and hiked deep into the woods before setting up camp near a rocky outcrop that overlooked a small valley. The view was stunning, the kind that makes you forget how far you've walked. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we built a fire and settled in, swapping stories, passing around a flask, and enjoying the quiet. The world felt simple out there. No deadlines, no traffic, no noise except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, we heard the skittering. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the wind shifting through the trees. A soft, erratic scraping against stone. I glanced at Mark, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Chris must have heard it too, because he set his flask down and leaned forward listening. The sound came again, closer this time. A dry, clicking noise like nails dragging across rock. It came from beyond the fire's glow, just past the jagged rocks that marked the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was an animal, probably a raccoon or a fox, but something about it made my skin prickle. Then it stopped. We waited, straining our ears, but there was only silence. After a few minutes, Chris chuckled, shook his head, and took another sip from the flask. "Relax," he said. "It's just the woods messing with us." Mark and I laughed, but it was forced. I could tell we were all a little on edge, though none of us wanted to admit it. The fire burned lower, the shadows stretched longer, and the forest around us seemed to hold its breath. Then it came again, faster this time. A scuttling, scraping sound, like something moving over stone on all fours. My stomach twisted. "All right," Mark muttered, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. "I'm checking it out." Chris and I followed, stepping cautiously toward the edge of the firelight. Mark swept the flashlight across the rocks, the beam bouncing off jagged surfaces and gnarled tree roots. Nothing. But I swear, just for a second, I saw something pale, something low to the ground, dart behind a boulder before disappearing into the darkness. Mark must have seen it too, because he let out a sharp breath and took a step back. "What the hell was that?" Chris laughed nervously. "Coyote, maybe?" "Coyotes don't move like that," I said. My voice sounded too tight, too small. We stood there for a long moment, scanning the trees, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. "Let's just go back to the fire," Chris finally said. "It's probably just a trick of the light." We nodded and retreated to our seats, but none of us were really at ease. The fire felt like a fragile barrier, the only thing separating us from whatever was out there. We kept our voices low, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. But deep down, I think we all knew better. The night stretched on. The fire would burn down to embers, and the cold started to creep in. Mark was the first to call it, tossing his sleeping bag out near the fire and crawling in. Chris followed, muttering something about how we were psyching ourselves out over nothing. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't shut off. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that pale shape darting just beyond the firelight, crouching low, waiting. My gut told me we weren't alone. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. Skitter. Click. Scrape. This time, it was right behind me. I went rigid, every muscle in my body locking up. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The fire had burned low, casting only a faint orange glow. My breath came in shallow gasps. I turned my head, slowly, carefully, not wanting to make a sound. And I saw it. A pale, human-like figure, crouched on all fours just at the edge of the clearing, watching me. Its limbs were too long, its fingers too thin, tipped with something dark and sharp. Its face was almost featureless. No nose, just deep, black eyes that stared directly into mine. It didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed up. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then, just as I thought I was about to pass out from sheer terror, it did something I'll never forget. It grinned. Not like a normal smile. No lips, just a slow, terrible stretch of skin, revealing a row of too small, too sharp teeth. Then it scuttled backward, fast, unnaturally fast, into the darkness, disappearing behind the rocks. I shot upright, gasping, scrambling to wake Chris and Mark. But by the time they groggily sat up, the thing was gone. "Dude, what the hell?" Chris mumbled, rubbing his eyes. I couldn't even speak. I just pointed toward the rocks, my hand shaking. Mark frowned, grabbed his flashlight, and swept it across the clearing. But there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. "Bad dream?" he asked. I shook my head violently. "No, it was real. I saw it." Chris sighed. "You're just tired, man." But I knew what I saw. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, staring at the darkness, waiting for that thing to come back. But it never did. By morning, I almost believed I had imagined it. Almost. But as we packed up to leave, I noticed something near the edge of the clearing. Something that made my blood run cold. Long, clawed tracks, leading right up to where I had been sleeping. I never went back to that place again. I love hiking alone. Most people I know don't get it. They think it's reckless, but for me, being alone in nature is one of the few times I feel completely free. No phone, no emails, no noise, just me and the trail. This happened in Arizona, somewhere in the remote stretches of the Mogollon Rim. It was early spring, and I had planned a 3-day trek through an area I had never explored before. The weather was perfect, cool mornings, warm afternoons, and a clear sky stretching endlessly overhead. The first day was uneventful, exactly what I wanted. The trail was well-worn but empty. Not a single other hiker in sight. I set up camp on a small ridge overlooking a valley, cooked a simple meal, and watched the sunset as I sipped from my canteen. The solitude felt good. That night, I slept soundly, with only the distant sound of wind moving through the pines. No animals, no disturbances. It wasn't until the second day that things began to feel off. I was about 5 miles into the day's hike when I first heard it. A single, high-pitched whistle, coming from somewhere behind me. Not a tune, just one long, slow note, held for maybe 3 or 4 seconds. I stopped listening. Birds chirped. The wind rustled the trees. But the whistle didn't repeat. Probably nothing, I told myself. Could have been the wind, or maybe just my imagination. I kept moving. An hour later, I heard it again. Closer this time. Same long, deliberate note. I turned around quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sign of another hiker. But something about it, it felt intentional. Like it wasn't just some random sound, but meant for me to hear. I picked up my pace. By midday, I had stopped for lunch near a creek, sitting on a fallen log as I ate. The sun was high, warm against my skin, and for a moment, I let myself relax. Maybe it really was nothing. Then, just as I took a sip of water, whistle. I nearly choked. It was much closer this time, maybe within 100 feet. I stood up fast, scanning the trees. The forest was thick, with towering pines and dense underbrush. If someone was following me, they were staying well out of sight. I called out, "Hello." My voice felt small in the vast silence that followed. No answer. My instincts told me to leave. I wasn't scared yet, but something was wrong. I packed up quickly and got moving. That's when I heard the crunching of footsteps in the underbrush. They weren't heavy, but they were there. Slow, deliberate, keeping pace with me, but always just out of sight. I moved faster. The trail twisted through the trees, narrow in some places, opening into clearings in others. Every so often, I'd stop suddenly, trying to catch whoever it was off guard. Nothing. It wasn't until I reached a wide clearing that I got the first undeniable sign that I wasn't imagining this. I stepped into the open, walking toward the other side where the trail disappeared into the trees again. About halfway across, I stopped. Something was wrong. The forest ahead was too quiet. Then, as I stood there, frozen, whistle. It came from directly behind me. I turned so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. There was no one there, but the bushes were still moving. I ran. I didn't stop running for at least a mile. My pack was heavy, my lungs burned, but I didn't care. My body was moving before my brain even had time to process what I had seen, or more accurately, what I hadn't seen. By late afternoon, I reached a steep downhill stretch of the trail. It wound tightly through a ravine, the high rock walls on either side making it feel like I was being funneled into something. I hated it. I had two choices: make camp soon or push on and try to reach my car by nightfall. I checked my map. I was still at least 10 miles from the trailhead. If I hiked hard, I might make it before full dark. That's when I heard the whistling again, except this time, it wasn't behind me. It was ahead. Panic took over. I turned off the main trail, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to put distance between me and whoever, or whatever, was playing this game. Branches scratched at my face and arms. I stumbled but kept going. After what felt like forever, I finally stopped, gasping for breath. I listened. Nothing. For the first time in hours, silence. I sank to the ground, my legs shaking. I needed to rest, just for a minute. I needed to think. That's when I noticed the footprints. Not mine. Someone else's. Fresh, and leading directly to where I was sitting. I felt my stomach drop. I had been herded here. I bolted. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to be away. The forest was darker now, the sun slipping below the ridgeline. My only focus was moving, pushing forward, not stopping. Then I saw it. A break in the trees. A road. I stumbled onto the asphalt, my legs barely able to keep me upright. Empty. No cars, no houses, just the end of the trail where I had parked that morning. My car was 100 yards away. I sprinted the last stretch, fumbled my keys, and threw myself inside, locking the doors behind me. My chest heaved. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the engine started. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back at the trailhead, and I swear to God, there was someone standing there. Not moving, not chasing, just watching, and I never heard the whistle again. I had always loved hiking alone. There was something about the solitude, the raw beauty of the wilderness, and the challenge of relying on nothing but my instincts and preparedness that made me feel truly alive. That particular autumn, I had taken time off work to do a solo trip in the Great Smoky Mountains. The plan was simple, a 3-day loop covering roughly 25 miles of well-maintained trails. It was something I had done before, nothing extreme, nothing dangerous. Or so I thought. The first day was uneventful. The forest was alive with the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the occasional burst of red and gold in the canopy above reminded me why I chose this time of year for my treks. I hiked at a steady pace, enjoying the silence, stopping only to take the occasional sip of water or adjust the straps on my pack. I set up camp near a small clearing just off the trail, cooked a simple meal over my small portable stove, and turned in early. That night, the forest was quiet. A light breeze rustled the leaves, an owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and the occasional snap of twigs under the weight of unseen animals reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. But it was all normal. It was the kind of quiet that put me at ease, rather than unnerved me. The next morning, I packed up my gear and set off at first light. The hike was easygoing, the air brisk. I followed the trail deeper into the forest, stopping at a scenic overlook to admire the valley below. It was around noon when I first noticed it. Footsteps. At first, I barely registered them. They were faint, distant. But after another half mile or so, I realized they weren't fading away. They were constant, steady, following me. I stopped. The sound stopped. I turned, scanning the trees behind me. Nothing. Just the same quiet forest. Maybe I had imagined it. I had read once that the human brain, when deprived of regular sounds, could fill the silence with phantom noises. Maybe that was all this was. I took a deep breath and continued on. The footsteps started again. This time, I was paying closer attention. The cadence matched my own, like an echo, but it was delayed, just enough to be off. I stopped again. Silence. My heart rate picked up. I did a slow circle, checking for any sign of movement. The trees were dense, their trunks forming a thick wall of brown and green. If someone was there, they were either very well hidden or very still. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe another hiker was behind me, taking a break when I did. Maybe they were keeping their distance. It was possible, though I had seen no sign of anyone on the trail all morning. I kept moving. This time, I changed my pace. I sped up, then slowed down. The footsteps adjusted. That was when I knew. Someone, or something, was definitely there. A primal kind of fear took over, the kind that prickled at the back of my neck and tightened my chest. I picked up the pace, practically power walking down the trail. The footsteps followed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But my body wasn't convinced. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there. Another mile passed. The footsteps never wavered. By the time I reached a small stream crossing, my nerves were frayed. I crouched down, pretending to adjust my boot, and used the opportunity to scan my surroundings. The trail behind me was empty, but something felt off. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, squirrels rustling in the leaves, were gone. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. That's when I saw it. A shape, just barely visible through the trees, standing still. Too still. My breath caught in my throat. It was about 50 yards back, partially obscured by branches. A person. A shadow. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but my gut told me to move. I stood and walked as calmly as I could, resisting the urge to sprint. I needed to keep my head. Running could turn this into a chase. If someone was following me, I didn't want to give them a reason to start. The footsteps resumed almost immediately. I walked faster. They kept up. After another 20 minutes, I came to a fork in the trail. I knew the left path led to a more remote section of the park, while the right would eventually loop back toward the main road. I hesitated for only a second before taking the right path. I needed to get back to my car, to civilization. For the first time in hours, the footsteps stopped. I listened. Silence. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe I had lost them, whoever they were. I kept moving, my pace brisk but steady. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the last thing I wanted was to be stuck out here after dark. Then, just as I started to feel safe, the footsteps returned. But this time they were faster. I broke into a run. My backpack thumped against my back. My breath came in ragged gasps. The trail blurred as I focused on one thing: getting the hell out of there. The footsteps were right behind me, closer than ever. I could hear them breathing. I veered off the trail, crashing through the underbrush. Thorns tore at my clothes, branches whipped my face, but I didn't stop. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air. Then silence. I collapsed against a tree, sucking in deep, ragged breaths. My ears strained for any sign of movement, but all I heard was the blood pounding in my head. Nothing. I waited 5 minutes. 10. The forest remained still. Cautiously, I crept back toward the trail. It was empty. No sign of anyone. No footprints, no rustling, no distant figure lurking in the trees. Like nothing had ever been there. I didn't question my luck. I walked, then jogged, then ran all the way back to the trailhead. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors behind me, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. But there was nothing. I never found out who, or what, was following me that day. Maybe it was just another hiker messing with me. Maybe it was my imagination. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Something was out there. And whatever it was, it didn't want to be seen. The hike was supposed to be just another weekend getaway, a break from the noise of the city, a breath of fresh mountain air, and a chance to reset my mind. My best friend, David, and I had planned it over a week ago, choosing a moderately challenging trail deep in the wilderness of Oregon. We'd both hiked plenty before, but this area was new to us, remote, quiet, perfect. We arrived in the late morning, parked at the small trailhead, and hoisted on our backpacks. The trail wound through thick pines and towering firs, sunlight streaming through in patches, dappling the earth with golden light. Birds called overhead, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush reminded us that we weren't alone. Just squirrels, maybe a deer if we were lucky. We set out at a relaxed pace, chatting about work, relationships, and the upcoming football season. Nothing felt out of place. If anything, the forest was peaceful. At least, at first. It started subtly. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not all at once, but gradually, like someone was dialing down the volume of the forest. Birds that had been chirping minutes ago were now gone. The wind in the trees stopped. Even our own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing sound. David noticed it too. "You hear that?" he asked, frowning. I nodded, scanning the trees. The trail had been well marked, but suddenly it seemed different. Narrower, almost as if we weren't on a designated path anymore. But that wasn't possible. We hadn't taken any turns, hadn't strayed off course. Weird, I muttered. Maybe just a dense patch? David shrugged, but he looked uneasy. We kept walking. Minutes passed, but the silence remained. It pressed against my ears, unnatural and heavy. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I shook it off. Maybe I was just psyching myself out. Then came the dizziness. It hit us both at the same time. One moment we were walking, and the next, I felt like my head had been plunged underwater. My vision wavered. My balance faltered. The world around me seemed to tilt, just for a second. I stopped and put a hand on my knee. Whoa, David was doing the same. You feel that? Yeah, like I just stood up too fast. The air felt thick, almost charged with static electricity. The trees around us seemed taller, darker, though that didn't make any sense. I rubbed my temples, willing the dizziness to pass. And then, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. The forest was normal again. The sounds returned, birds chirping, leaves rustling. But something was off. David checked his watch. Then his face twisted in confusion. Dude, tell me I'm crazy. I glanced at my own watch and felt my stomach drop. We had lost 15 minutes. Not a minute. Not 2. 15 full minutes were just gone. What the hell? I whispered. David shook his head. I don't know. We didn't stop. We didn't black out. We were just walking. And now, it's 15 minutes later. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. My heart was pounding. I tried to reason through it. Maybe our watches were wrong. Maybe we had been so deep in conversation that we miscounted time. But no, this wasn't just forgetting a few minutes. This was something else. Something that made my skin crawl. We pushed forward, trying to shake the unease, but the forest felt different now. Every shadow seemed darker. Every sound sharper. My body felt normal, but my mind couldn't shake the sense that something was watching us. Then we found the footprints. At first, I thought they were ours, hiking boots, deep impressions in the soft earth. But then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There were more prints than there should have been. David saw it too. He crouched down, tracing the edges of the indentations with his fingers. These aren't ours. He was right. The extra prints weren't quite the same shape as our boots. They were narrower, longer, almost like they had been made by bare feet. And the worst part? They walked in circles around our own prints. Something had been following us. Something we never saw. I swallowed hard. We need to leave. David nodded. Yeah, now. We turned back, moving quickly, but not running. The trees felt closer than before. The air still carried that static charge, making the hair on my arms stand up. And then, from behind us, came a sound that froze me in my tracks. A whisper. Not words. Just a sound. A breath, a sigh. Something that shouldn't have been there. David's face went pale. He heard it too. We started moving faster. My pulse hammered in my ears. The sound didn't repeat, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, never left. When we finally reached the car, I barely waited for David to get inside before slamming the doors shut and locking them. Only then did I realize I was shaking. We drove in silence for a long time. Finally, David spoke. We don't talk about this. I exhaled. Agreed. But even now, years later, I still think about that hike. About the silence, the dizziness, the missing time. And worst of all, the footprints. Something else had been there with us that day. And whatever it was, it knew we were there too. I've done a lot of solo camping in my life. It's something I enjoy, getting away from everything, feeling the quiet of the wilderness, the simple routine of setting up a camp, making a fire, cooking, and then just listening to the sounds of nature. I've never been afraid of the woods, never been the type to psych myself out with horror stories or let my imagination run wild. I always thought I was too rational for that. But one trip changed the way I feel about being alone in the dark forever. It was early autumn, just cool enough at night to make a campfire feel nice. I had planned a 2-night trip into the Appalachian wilderness, hiking in about 10 miles to a remote spot I had marked on a map months before. It was the kind of place where you were almost guaranteed not to see another person the entire time. That was the appeal. No other campers, no man-made noises, just me and nature. I parked my truck at the trailhead, hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, and started the trek. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were my boots crunching leaves and the occasional bird call. It took me a good 5 hours to reach the spot. a small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by thick trees. I set up camp methodically, tent up, sleeping bag unrolled, firewood gathered. By the time the sun started setting, I had a good fire going. I cooked a simple meal, sat back against a log, and just listened. The forest was alive in a way that felt peaceful. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. It was around midnight when I decided to turn in. I let the fire die down to embers, crawled into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I slept before something woke me. A sound. Not the normal sounds of the forest, not the wind or an animal moving in the distance. This was close. Soft. Deliberate. Footsteps. At first, I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. But then I heard it again, slow, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. I held my breath, listening. I could feel my heartbeat picking up, my body tense, waiting. The footsteps stopped directly behind me, where the thin nylon of my tent was stretched taut. The only thing between me and whatever was out there was a millimeter of fabric. I swallowed, my mouth dry. Then, something even worse happened. Breathing. Not the quick snorts of a deer, not the sniffing of an animal. This was human breathing, slow, deep, steady. Someone was standing outside my tent, just standing there, breathing. I reached slowly for my flashlight. My hand trembled as I clicked it on. The moment the beam cut through the darkness, the breathing stopped. I sat up, trying to aim the light through the thin fabric of the tent. Nothing. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my half-asleep brain had misinterpreted the wind. Then I heard it again. A single footstep. I turned the flashlight off, not wanting to give away my exact position inside the tent. I strained to listen. The night was dead silent. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I don't know how long I sat there, gripping my flashlight, heart hammering. But eventually, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I lay back down, still holding the flashlight, and forced my breathing to slow. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I woke up with a jolt. Something was wrong. The air inside the tent felt thick, suffocating. I turned onto my side, groggy, and then I saw them. Two eyes, reflecting the faint light of the moon, staring at me from outside the tent. They were high up, too high to be an animal. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. I froze. My mind scrambled for an explanation. A trick of the light, a reflection, but no, they were there. I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me. I slowly reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. I didn't want to make a sound, didn't want to provoke whatever, or whoever, was standing there. Minutes passed. The eyes didn't move, just stared. Then, as if breaking a spell, they disappeared. Just gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, listening for any sign of movement. The forest stayed silent. When the first light of dawn broke, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped outside. My breath was visible in the crisp morning air. The clearing looked normal, undisturbed, peaceful, like nothing had happened. But then I saw them. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. They circled my tent twice, then stopped directly in front of where my head had been. I packed up in record time, my hands shaking. I didn't eat, didn't take a break. Just shoved everything into my pack and started the hike back. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, panting, my legs burning from the pace I'd kept. As I threw my pack into the back seat, I turned for one last look at the trail. There, standing at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Watching me. I got in my truck and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was out there that night. But I do know one thing. I've never gone solo camping again. And I never will. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A solo backpacking trip into the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana. 5 days of complete solitude, fresh air, and endless miles of untouched forest. I had always loved being alone in the wild. Something about it made me feel sharper, more in tune with everything around me. I had planned my route carefully. A long loop that would take me deep into the wilderness and then back toward the trailhead where my truck was parked. I had my pack loaded with everything I needed: tent, food, bear spray, my hunting knife, and a small handgun for emergencies. Not that I ever expected to need it. Day one went by smoothly. The weather was cool but not too cold, and I made good time, covering nearly 12 miles before setting up camp near a stream. I cooked a simple meal, drank some coffee, and watched the sun go down behind the mountains. I woke up early the next morning, broke camp, and kept moving. The trail became more rugged, winding through dense patches of pine and crossing a few rocky inclines. By midday, I reached a clearing that overlooked a deep valley, stretching for miles in either direction. The view was breathtaking, but that's when I saw it. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. There was something hanging from a tree about 20 yards off the trail. My first thought was that it was a fallen branch caught in the limbs. But as I moved closer, I realized it was something else entirely. A deer, strung up by its back legs, its body hanging upside down from a thick tree limb. I stopped in my tracks. Something about it felt wrong. The deer's throat had been slit cleanly, but there was no blood. Its body looked almost drained. The way it was hanging didn't look like a hunter's kill. It wasn't skinned or gutted. It just dangled there, its lifeless eyes staring at nothing. A shiver ran through me. I had seen my fair share of dead animals in the wild, but this was different. I stepped closer, looking around for any signs of human activity. No footprints, no drag marks, no signs of a camp nearby. The more I stared at the deer, the more uneasy I felt. This wasn't normal. I wasn't sure what to do. It wasn't illegal to hunt out here, but there were proper ways to do it. This wasn't one of them, and the fact that the deer had no visible wounds apart from the slit throat made my stomach churn. I glanced at the ground beneath it. Dry, not a drop of blood anywhere. Something wasn't right. I decided to keep moving. The longer I stood there, the worse the feeling got, like I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I camped that night near a small lake, but I didn't sleep well. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the brush put me on edge. I kept replaying the image of the deer in my head. There was no logical explanation for it, at least none that sat right with me. The next morning, I packed up quickly and hit the trail again. The plan was to loop around and start heading back toward my truck. I kept my pace steady, trying to enjoy the scenery and push the unease from my mind. But by midday, the feeling was back. It started as a vague sense of unease, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. At first, I told myself I was just spooked from the deer. But as I hiked deeper into the forest, that feeling only got stronger. I wasn't alone. I stopped multiple times, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. Just silence. But I knew someone was there. I changed my route slightly, cutting off the main trail and moving through denser trees. If someone was following me, I wanted to see if they'd do the same. About a mile later, I stopped again. Waited. Nothing. Maybe I was being paranoid. I kept moving, but the feeling never fully went away. The next morning, I woke up to a heavy mist covering the ground. It gave everything an eerie, muted look. The air was damp and cold, and I felt stiff as I packed up my gear. I was only a day's hike from my truck now. If I pushed hard, I could make it out by nightfall. By noon, the mist had burned off, but my unease hadn't. I kept glancing over my shoulder, checking the trees. And then I saw it. Another deer, hanging from a tree, identical to the first. My stomach twisted into knots. I forced myself to move closer, scanning the ground, the trees, everything. No tracks. No signs of blood. No sign of whoever was doing this. What were the odds of stumbling upon two dead deer strung up like that, miles apart? This wasn't coincidence. Someone was out here, and they wanted me to know it. I picked up my pace, moving as quickly as I could without running. I didn't want to be out here any longer than necessary. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. My legs ached, my shoulders burned from carrying my pack, and my nerves were fried. I checked my map, only a few more miles to go. That's when I heard it. A whistle. Sharp. Clear. Not a bird, not an animal. A person. I froze, my heart pounding. It had come from somewhere up ahead, just beyond the bend in the trail. I waited, listening. Silence. I pulled my knife from its sheath, gripping it tightly as I moved forward. Every step felt like I was walking straight into a trap. Then I saw them. 3 figures standing in the trees, about 50 yards away. Not moving, just standing, watching. They were dressed in dark clothing, partially hidden by the trees. I couldn't make out their faces. My blood turned to ice. I took a slow step back. They didn't move. Then, one of them raised their hand. Not in a wave, not in a greeting. Just a slow, deliberate motion. That was enough. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran, branches whipping against my face, lungs burning. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, jumped inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I floored it down the dirt road, not looking in the rearview mirror until I was miles away. There was nothing there, but I knew what I saw, and I knew I'd never come back. I never reported it. What would I say? That I saw some deer strung up in the woods and got a bad feeling? That some strangers stood in the trees and watched me? No laws were broken. No crime was committed. But I know what I saw, and I know someone or something was out there, watching, waiting. I don't hike alone anymore. Hiking alone in the Rockies had always been a dream of mine. Something about the raw, untouched wilderness, the crisp mountain air, and the complete solitude. I had done countless solo hikes before, but nothing as remote as this. I planned a 5-day trek through an area that few ventured into, far from well-traveled paths and crowded campsites. Just me, my backpack, and miles of untouched forest. I started early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the jagged peaks. The first day was uneventful, just miles of winding trails, towering pines, and the occasional distant call of an unseen bird. By evening, I set up camp near a small, pristine lake. The water was still, reflecting the last hues of daylight, and the air had that fresh, almost electric scent of pine and earth. After a simple meal, I crawled into my tent and listened to the sounds of the wilderness as I drifted off to sleep. The tapping woke me up. At first, I thought it was a dream, just some half-remembered sound carrying over from whatever I had been dreaming about. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, almost delicate, like fingertips lightly drumming on the fabric of my tent. My first thought was that it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind. But there was no wind. The air was completely still, heavy with the silence of deep night. I held my breath, listening. Nothing moved outside. No rustling leaves, no crunching undergrowth. Just the tapping. I reached for my flashlight, the small beam cutting through the darkness as I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The trees stood motionless, their dark forms stretching toward the sky. The ground was undisturbed. No sign of an animal, no fallen branches, nothing that could have caused the sound. I let the tent flap fall back into place, zipped it shut, and lay back down. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it had been some tiny animal scurrying past. I closed my eyes and tried to relax. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, closer. A shiver ran down my spine. It was deliberate, not random, not natural. I gripped my knife, my heartbeat thudding against my ribs. For what felt like hours, I lay there, every muscle tense, waiting. But eventually the tapping stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, I had convinced myself that it had been nothing. A trick of the mind, exhaustion playing games with my senses. I packed up camp and pushed forward, deeper into the wilderness. The second day's hike was more grueling, steeper inclines, rougher terrain. By late afternoon, I had reached a secluded valley, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. I set up camp in a clearing, surrounded on 3 sides by thick forest and on the 4th by a sheer rock face. It felt safe, enclosed. As night fell, I forced myself to ignore the unease creeping into my mind. I ate, read a little from the book I'd brought, then settled in for the night, determined to get some real rest. Then, just past midnight, tap, tap, tap. I sat up so fast I nearly knocked over my lantern. My breath caught in my throat. Tap, tap, tap. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. It was outside my tent. I clenched my knife and carefully reached for my flashlight. My fingers were shaking as I clicked it on. The tent's thin fabric glowed under the beam, but it revealed nothing beyond. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The clearing was empty. The trees loomed in the distance, their branches still and lifeless. I shone the light across the perimeter of my camp, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was nothing, but then I noticed something new. A single, small stone sat just outside my tent. It hadn't been there before. My stomach twisted. Had someone placed it there? Was someone messing with me? I listened, every nerve in my body on edge, but the night was silent. I pulled the stone inside and stared at it for a long time before finally setting it aside and forcing myself to lie back down. I barely slept. I should have turned back. Every instinct told me to. But I was 2 days in, and my stubbornness wouldn't let me quit. I pressed on. That night, I camped near an old, gnarled tree at the edge of a deep ravine. The terrain was harsher here, the landscape shifting into something more primal, more ancient. I had barely settled in when it started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time I was ready. I snapped on my flashlight, knife in hand, and ripped open the tent. The beam swept across the darkness. Nothing, just the empty, silent forest. But then, a shadow moved between the trees. Quick, too quick, like a flicker in the corner of my vision. I whipped my flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing there. The trees stood silent, unmoving. I strained my ears, but the night remained eerily quiet. Then I saw it. The stone. Another one, placed right outside my tent. Something was out here. Something was watching me. I grabbed the stone and hurled it into the darkness, listening as it clattered against the trees. Then I backed into my tent, zipped it up, and gripped my knife with white-knuckled fingers. The tapping didn't return that night, but I didn't sleep a second. I sat awake, listening, waiting. By the 4th day, I had had enough. I decided to cut my trip short and head back. I pushed hard, covering as much ground as possible. By nightfall, I was exhausted, but I refused to stop until I was too tired to be afraid. I found a clearing and set up camp one last time. That night, I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, gripping my knife. I was done playing games. The wind picked up, rustling the branches. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the trees. Then, just beyond the light's edge, I saw it. A figure. It stood just beyond the fire's glow, still as a statue. I could barely make out its shape. A person? Or something else? My mouth went dry. Tap, tap, tap. My blood turned to ice. The figure didn't move. It didn't step forward, didn't retreat. Just stood there, tapping on something unseen. I reached for my flashlight, my heart pounding against my ribs. The moment I switched it on, the figure was gone. Just like that, as if it had never been there at all. I packed up my gear and ran. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I didn't stop, didn't rest until I saw the first light of dawn breaking over the mountains. By noon, I was back at my car. Safe, but the feeling never left me. That unnerving sense that something had followed me, watched me, waited for me. To this day, I don't know what it was. I only know that I will never go back there again. I was alone. The first night out on a solo trip was always the hardest. It was one thing to be out here in the daylight, setting up camp, feeling capable and strong. But as soon as the sun dropped below the horizon and the sky turned black, the woods became something else. Every noise felt sharper. Every gust of wind sounded too much like movement. The silence between the noises was worse than the noises themselves. I had picked a spot on the edge of the forest, looking out over a small slope that led down to a pebble beach. During the day, it had seemed like the perfect place, secluded, beautiful, just far enough from the main trails that I wouldn't have to worry about passing hikers stumbling into my campsite. But now, as I lay in my small tent with nothing but thin fabric separating me from the wild, I wasn't so sure. I was wide awake. I had tried everything to fall asleep, lying on my back, my side, pulling my sleeping bag tighter, loosening it, focusing on my breathing, but nothing worked. My mind wouldn't let me rest. I had camped alone before, but no matter how many times I did it, that first night was always the same. It took time for my brain to adjust to the sounds of the woods, and right now it wasn't adjusting. The forest was alive with noise. Leaves rustling, branches creaking, the occasional hoot of an owl. Normal things. But my brain didn't process them as normal. Instead, it wanted to interpret every little thing as danger. I kept imagining things that weren't there. Eyes watching me from the trees, footsteps just beyond the range of my hearing, the outline of a figure standing motionless in the dark. I hated how my mind did this to me. I tried to reason with myself. This was a protected park. The only real threats were black bears, and I had taken every precaution. My food was stored properly, my campsite was clean, and bears generally didn't go looking for trouble unless they had a reason. The more likely culprits for the noise outside were raccoons, porcupines, or deer. But reason didn't mean much when I was lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my tent, my heart hammering in my chest at every snap of a twig. Then I heard something heavier, a real footstep. I stopped breathing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a squirrel. It was weight on the forest floor. A branch cracked, not far from my tent. Something was moving, and it was big. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I went completely still, straining my ears. The footsteps were slow but deliberate. Something was walking through the trees, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. I wanted to believe it was a deer, but my mind wouldn't let me. Instead, it went straight to the worst possibilities. A person, a stranger, out here in the dark, approaching my tent. Why? There was no reason for anyone to be out here. I had a knife in my pack, but it was buried beneath my clothes. My headlamp was within reach, but I was afraid to turn it on. If I made a sound, if I moved, whoever, or whatever, was out there would know I was awake. The footsteps stopped. I lay there, frozen, my breath shallow and uneven. A long moment of silence passed. Then, suddenly, a loud crash. Something tumbled down the slope right outside my tent, sending loose rocks skittering across the beach. My stomach clenched. I fumbled for my headlamp, my hands shaking. I needed to see. I needed to know. My fingers found the switch, and with a quick breath, I clicked it on and unzipped the tent door just enough to shine the beam outside. I expected the worst. Instead, I saw a massive shape sprawled out on the pebbles. For a split second, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. Then it hit me. An elk. A huge, clumsy, very much alive elk, blinking in confusion as it struggled to get its footing on the loose rocks. It must have lost its balance coming down the slope and fallen right onto the beach in front of my tent. My entire body sagged with relief. I wanted to laugh, but I was still too wired from the adrenaline dump. The elk finally scrambled back to its feet, shook itself off, and trotted unsteadily back toward the tree line, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a long time, listening to the woods, my heart still racing. I wasn't in danger. I wasn't going to die alone in the Canadian backwoods. It was just the first night playing tricks on me again. Eventually, I crawled back into my sleeping bag, turned off my light, and stared up at the tent ceiling. The forest noises were still there, but now they felt a little more normal. I still didn't sleep well, but by the time the sun started creeping through the trees the next morning, I felt stupid for ever being so scared. Just another first night in the woods. The 5 of us, barely adults, were packed into my best friend's old sedan, winding our way through the roads of Tennessee, heading for the Smoky Mountains. We were 17 and 18 years old, a mix of high school seniors and fresh graduates, eager to test ourselves against the wilderness. It was the mid-'80s, before Gatlinburg turned into a tourist trap, and the mountains felt wilder back then, less regulated, more dangerous. We rolled into a gas station on the edge of town, one of those places with a single rusty pump and a flickering fluorescent sign buzzing in the damp evening air. The place smelled of old oil and damp wood. As we stepped out to stretch our legs, a toothless old man leaning against the wall gave us a long, knowing look. His face was lined with deep creases, his hair wild under a stained ball cap. "I wouldn't head up there," he muttered, squinting at us with eyes that had probably seen more than we ever would. "Thar's a storm a-brewin' da." Like the cocky idiots we were, we barely gave it a second thought. One of us, probably me, laughed and said something stupid about having rain parkas. Then we piled back into the car and drove straight for the trailhead, too full of ourselves to listen to a man who had probably lived in these mountains his whole life. The first stretch of the hike was brutal. The map hadn't fully conveyed how steep the trail was. We thought we were in shape, but that first leg felt like climbing a ladder made of roots and rock. My thighs burned within the first mile. The backpacks dug into our shoulders. The sky, already gray when we left, darkened further. 2 hours in, the rain started. At first, it was just a light drizzle, cooling the sweat on our backs. But the temperature was dropping fast, and soon, the light rain turned into freezing rain. Within minutes, our jackets were slick with ice. Water seeped into our gloves, our boots, our sleeves. We pressed on, knowing we had to make it to a campsite before dark. The last thing we wanted was to be setting up tents on the side of a mountain in the dark. By the time we stumbled into a flat clearing, our designated campsite, our hands were nearly useless. My fingers were shaking so badly, I couldn't even untie my boots. My hands were so stiff that I had to cut my bootlaces off with a portable saw just to get my feet out of them. The 5 of us huddled in a tent, sealing it up tight to trap in warmth. The air inside grew thick with our breath, and by morning, frost had formed on the inside walls. Outside, the world had transformed overnight. For inches of snow covered the ground. My boots, which I had stupidly left by the fire hoping they'd dry, were frozen solid, curled up like dead things on the rocks. That morning, we all knew we had made a mistake. We were miles into the mountains, freezing, wet, and underprepared. Every one of us showed signs of hypothermia, shaking, slurred speech, slow thinking. We needed to get out. We had a choice. Turn back the 5 miles we had already hiked or push forward 3 more miles to where the trail supposedly intersected with another road. Going forward seemed like the best option. It was shorter, and we figured the road would be a quicker way back to town. But the mountain had other plans. The trail was buried under snow, but we could still follow it, packed down by previous hikers. We moved slowly, still half frozen, trying to keep our footing. The cold seeped into my bones, and every step felt heavier than the last. The wind had picked up, blowing icy flakes into our faces. Then we hit the river. The bridge was gone. Just gone. The storm had washed it away, leaving behind a swollen, fast-moving river between us and the road. We had 2 options: turn around and hike 7 miles back the way we came, or wade through a freezing, waist-deep river. 7 miles back in wet clothes, with nightfall coming fast, wasn't an option. We had no choice. One by one, we stripped off our boots and pants, shoving them into the straps of our backpacks to keep them dry. Barefoot, in nothing but underwear, we stepped into the river. The moment my foot hit the water, I gasped. It wasn't just cold. It felt like knives stabbing into my skin. The pain shot up my legs, through my spine, into my skull. The current was stronger than it looked, pushing against my knees as I took slow, careful steps forward. The rocks beneath my feet were slick. My toes curled against them, trying to find some kind of grip. The water climbed higher, thighs, then waist, then chest. Each step sent another shock of pain through my body. I felt my muscles tightening, locking up. Then one by one, we all fell in. The current was relentless, knocking our feet out from under us, sending us sprawling into the icy water. I went under for a second, my breath stolen from my lungs, and came up gasping. My whole body was on fire, then numb. We scrambled, clawing at rocks, dragging ourselves to the other side. My hands barely worked. My skin was raw and white, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then my best friend, the one who owned the car, stood up and realized something was missing. His pants. Gone. With them, his wallet, his $200, and worst of all, the car keys. We lost our minds. 5 barefoot teenagers, half frozen and soaking wet, screaming and scrambling through the snow, trying to spot a pair of pants somewhere along the riverbank. We ran like lunatics, slipping and falling, our bare feet going numb in the snow. The pants were gone. There was no backup key. No way to pay for a hotel. No way to call for help. We were screwed. With no other choice, we started walking. 7 miles. Soaking wet. Barefoot. My toes burned, then went completely numb. I didn't know if they were bleeding, and I didn't care. The wind cut through me like a blade. Every step was torture. By the time we hit a road, we must have looked like hell. A local truck driver pulled over, took one look at us, and drove us into town. At the hotel, the lady at the front desk took pity on us. She let us stay in a room with just the promise that our parents would wire money for a new set of keys. She even gave us some food, though I barely remember eating. That night, as I lay in a real bed, my body still aching, I thought about the sounds we had heard in the freezing rain, loud cracks, crashes in the dark. We had thought the wind was taking down branches. But in the morning, looking at the trees, we realized the truth. The rain had frozen onto the trees, and as the wind bent them, the ice cracked and fell like shrapnel. If we had camped in the wrong spot, one of those massive ice-covered limbs could have come down right on top of us. How none of us died, I'll never know. Maybe dumb luck. Maybe something else. But I do know one thing. The next time an old man warns me about a storm in the mountains, I'll listen. 12 days in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. Over 100 miles on foot, carrying everything on our backs, miles away from any road, any town, any real sign of civilization. It was the kind of trip you don't fully grasp until you're in it, deep in the silence of the forest, feeling the weight of every mile in your legs, feeling how small you really are out there. We started off strong, packs heavy but manageable, excited for the challenge. The trail stretched ahead, winding through thick pine forests and open valleys, cutting through rocky terrain and narrow ridgelines. The air smelled like pine needles and dirt, clean and untouched. We were moving well, covering ground at a good pace, finding our rhythm. On the second day, we saw them. A mother grizzly with her cubs, maybe 40 yards away. Too close. Way too close. She was massive, her fur thick and brown, her head turning slowly as she watched us. The cubs stuck close to her legs, barely more than shadows against the trees. We didn't move. We barely breathed. She sniffed the air, ears twitching, muscles tense under her fur. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, every nerve in my body screaming. You hear stories about grizzlies. You see videos, you read advice. Don't run, don't turn your back, don't make sudden movements. But none of that prepares you for actually seeing one in the wild. Nothing but open space and a few trees between you and her. After what felt like forever, she turned, nudged her cubs, and they disappeared into the brush. We stood there for a long time, the weight of what just happened sinking in. If she had decided we were a threat, there was nothing we could have done. No phone to call for help. No road to flag down a car. Just miles of wilderness. We made it to camp just before dark. The night settled in fast, the temperature dropping, the sky full of stars. Everything was still. No distant hum of a highway, no faint glow of city lights. Just darkness and the sound of wind through the trees. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up, crashing in the water nearby. My brain went straight to the worst-case scenario. Bear. Lying in my sleeping bag, I strained to hear, heart pounding in my ears. More crashing, heavy footsteps in the shallow water. It sounded big. I pictured that mother grizzly from earlier, imagined her massive shape moving through the darkness, sniffing at our camp, at our food, at us. My fingers tightened around the bear spray in my sleeping bag. I didn't know what I would do if it really was a bear. The sound moved closer, then away. The water splashed, something heavy moving through it. Then it was gone. The next morning, we found moose tracks along the riverbank. Not a bear, but still massive, still unpredictable. 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone, able to charge in an instant. Out there, everything felt dangerous. As the days passed, we fell into a routine. Wake up, break camp, hike. The wilderness stretched in every direction, untouched and wild. Sometimes we saw signs of other people. A faded boot print in the dirt, an old fire ring at a campsite. But for the most part, it was just us. Days without seeing another soul. We filtered water from streams, cooked simple meals over a tiny stove, packed out everything we brought in. Every night, we hung our food in trees, hoping it would be enough to keep the bears away. By day 11, we were back at that same campsite from earlier, the last stop before finishing the trip. It should have felt like a victory. Almost done. Almost back to warm showers and real food, and sleeping in a bed. But then we saw the tracks. Grizzly tracks, fresh, pressed into the dirt right on top of our old boot prints. Not from days ago. Hours, maybe. The size of them made my stomach drop. Deep, wide imprints in the mud, claws visible in some of them. The bear had walked the same trail we had, following our path, passing right through the camp where we were about to sleep. We were exhausted, but none of us slept much that night. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me holding my breath, straining to hear more. The wind made the trees groan, shifting their weight, and every time it sounded like footsteps. I lay there, bear spray next to me, gripping the fabric of my sleeping bag, heart racing. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have slept a little, because suddenly it was morning. Cold, damp, gray light filtering through the trees. We packed up quickly, barely speaking, moving on autopilot. No one wanted to linger. The last miles felt longer than they should have, every step heavy, but eventually the trees thinned and the trail let us out. Walking back to the car felt surreal. Civilization didn't feel real anymore. It felt like we had spent a lifetime out there, moving through some ancient place where we didn't belong. The weight of it all settled in. How close we had been to something going wrong, how small we were out there, how easy it would have been to never make it out. That trip stuck with me. Not just the exhaustion or the hunger or the sore muscles. The fear. That deep, primal fear of knowing something bigger, stronger, and more powerful is out there close watching. That fear of being so far from help that no one would even know if something happened to you. That realization that, in the wild, you're just another animal, no more important than anything else. Zaleski State Forest is deep, quiet, and old. Southern Ohio has a way of feeling forgotten, like time doesn't work the same way there. Endless trees, thick undergrowth, ridges and hollows that stretch for miles. It's not the kind of place you end up in by accident. You have to want to be there. It was about 10 years ago when I hiked and camped there with my dad, uncle, and cousins. We weren't new to hiking, but this place was different. Back then, Google Maps barely showed anything for the area. No cell service, no easy way to check a GPS. We had to rely on a paper map to find the trailhead. It was easy to get turned around, and even easier to feel isolated. The plan was simple: hike in, camp for a few nights, then hike back out. We all had our own one-person tents, spaced about 20 to 30 feet apart. Just enough distance for privacy, but close enough to still feel like we were camping together. That first night, we set up camp near an area we'd heard rumors about, an abandoned tunnel, supposedly haunted. None of us really believed in that stuff, but we all knew about the stories. The forest settled into its usual rhythm as the sun went down. The woods in Zaleski have a strange way of swallowing sound. At first, everything seems loud: crickets, frogs, distant rustling. But after a while, you notice how quiet it actually is. No distant highway noise. No hum of planes overhead. Just silence, stretching on forever. I laid in my tent, staring up at the fabric above me, listening. Every now and then, I'd hear movement outside, something small, probably a raccoon or an opossum nosing through the leaves. The wind shifted through the trees, making the branches creak. Normal forest sounds. Nothing out of place. Then, around 3 a.m., it happened. A sound so loud it tore through the silence like a bomb going off. It was massive, deep, metallic. Not a tree falling, not even close. A tree makes a long, drawn-out cracking and snapping before it finally collapses. This was instant. One single, enormous impact. I shot up, heart hammering in my chest. My first thought was a car crash, but that didn't make any sense. We were miles from any road. There was no way a vehicle could be out here. The forest went dead silent. No insects. No wind. No movement. Just absolute stillness. I sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a rockfall. It sounded like metal hitting metal, something impossibly large, something that shouldn't be out here. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, I laid back down, but sleep didn't come. My mind kept circling back to the sound. There was no explanation. The next morning, we all looked at each other, knowing none of us had slept much. We didn't talk about it. What was there to say? We had all heard it. We had all felt that moment of sheer, animal fear. But there was nothing to do except pack up and keep moving. For the rest of the trip, the feeling never quite left. That sense of being watched, of something just out of sight. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the isolation, the exhaustion, the tricks your mind plays when you're deep in the woods. But I've camped a lot of places. I've spent nights alone on the Appalachian Trail, hiked in remote areas where I didn't see another person for days. And I've never heard anything like that night in Zaleski. Hiking in Nepal was supposed to be an adventure. A challenge, sure. Physically demanding, of course. But I thought the biggest struggles would be things like sore feet, long days, and the cold at high altitude. I was wrong. The trek ended up being something else entirely. 36 days of exhaustion, sickness, fear, and too many close calls. Looking back, I still don't know how we made it through. It started with a landslide. We had planned one route, but as we made our way toward the village we needed to pass through, we realized something was wrong. The air had a heaviness to it, a smell that wasn't just dirt and rock. It was worse, rotting flesh, thick in the heat of the sun. The entire village had been wiped out. Houses crushed, the ground unstable beneath our feet. We picked our way across the ruined land, stepping carefully, trying not to think too much about what we might be stepping over. It was a slow, miserable crossing, the stench clinging to our clothes. We barely spoke when we made it to the other side. But that wasn't the worst part. We finally reached the starting point for our planned route, only to learn that an avalanche had just torn through. A group of hikers had been buried, dead. Some of the bodies hadn't even been recovered yet. It was clear that continuing on wasn't an option, so we had to change our plan. We picked a different trail and started walking. By day 4, we reached a small village, one of those places barely touched by tourism. It should have been a welcome stop, a chance to rest. But something was off. People whispered in small groups, eyes flicking toward us as we walked through. We found out why soon enough. Just a week before, a local man had been caught poisoning tourists, killing them, and selling their gear. His neighbors had finally turned him in, but who knew how many others like him were still out there? It left a bad feeling in my stomach. That feeling only got worse as the days went on. At one point, we lost the trail. The path had faded into loose rock, and we weren't sure which way to go. That's when we met him, a local man, standing a short distance away, pointing in one direction. "This way," he said. Nothing else. Just those two words, repeated over and over. He didn't answer questions, didn't seem concerned when we hesitated. He just kept pointing, urging us forward. We followed him. That was a mistake. We had been around 2,500 meters in elevation when we met him. By the time we realized something was wrong, we were at 5,500 meters. In one day, a climb like that isn't just difficult, it's dangerous. Altitude sickness can hit fast, and we had pushed too hard too fast. The second we understood what had happened, we turned and ran, trying to descend before it was too late. The sun was setting, and we stumbled down the mountain, lungs burning, vision swimming. By the time we reached lower ground, we were exhausted. But there was no real chance to rest. At the highest point of the trek, we made another mistake, drinking from a bad water source. It was the only option we had, and we were desperate. What followed was a combination of altitude sickness and giardia, a nightmare of nausea, dizziness, and violent sickness from both ends. We could barely keep walking, but we had no choice. And the locals? Almost all of them carried machetes, long, curved, rusted blades, always within reach. They weren't aggressive, but seeing those weapons everywhere added an extra layer of unease to everything. Then there was the village. We had taken a non-tourist route for the last 2 weeks, ending up in a place unlike anywhere else we had seen. Most of the people there had physical deformities, crooked limbs, hunched backs, twisted fingers. There was no common language, so we communicated in gestures, asking for a place to sleep. They gave us food. It smelled off, but we hadn't eaten in over 13 hours. We forced it down, knowing we needed the energy. By morning, we regretted it. Our bodies gave out. We barely made it out of our shelter before we started violently purging everything we had eaten. Over and over, our stomachs emptied until there was nothing left but pain. But we couldn't stay. We had to leave. There was no help here, no supplies that wouldn't make us sicker. We turned what should have been an 8-hour walk into 2 miserable 13-hour days, pushing forward, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Every step was a battle, every minute stretched on forever. Finally, we made it back to civilization. A guide overheard us talking about the village and told us the truth. Their food storage had been contaminated with fertilizer, and at least 20 of them had died because of it. We had barely survived. It took a full week for our bodies to recover. Even after we stopped vomiting, the weakness remained. The memories of that trip never really faded. It wasn't just a bad hike. It was something else. Something that stripped us down to nothing, pushing us past limits we didn't know we had. I still don't know how we made it through. But I do know this: I'll never go back. The Appalachian Trail had always been something I wanted to do. At 16, I had the chance to go on a 6-day, 50-mile hike through a section of it, and I thought it would be one of the best experiences of my life. It was in a way, but not for the reasons I expected. I still look back on it and wonder how I made it through. The physical exhaustion, the dehydration, the fear. I had never felt so helpless in my life. The first day was fine. Long, tiring, but manageable. The pack on my back weighed around 40 pounds, which was a lot for someone as small as I was, but I powered through. I had trained for this, and I was determined to push myself. We set up camp after the first stretch of hiking, and I remember thinking that, while it was tough, I could handle it. I had no idea what was coming. On the second day, everything changed. We had a 12-mile day ahead of us, and 3 miles in, I was hiking through a narrow section of trail with 2 other guys. The path was tight, overgrown with brush, and we had to move single file to get through. The morning air was thick with humidity, and sweat was already running down my back. My shoulders ached from the weight of my pack, but I kept moving, focusing on the rhythm of my steps. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp, stabbing pain shot through my legs. It felt like tiny needles puncturing my skin all at once. I barely had time to register what was happening before I looked down and saw them. hundreds of small, black bodies swarming my legs. Ground hornets. Panic took over instantly. All three of us screamed and bolted. My pack, heavy and awkward, slammed against my back as I ran. My lungs burned. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get away. My boots pounded against the dirt, but the hornets were still on me. I felt more and more stings, each one a searing jolt of pain. It felt like my skin was being set on fire. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, I finally stopped. My chest was heaving, and my entire body was shaking. I looked down. My legs were covered in angry red welts, and to my horror, some of the hornets were still stuck in my socks, their tiny bodies writhing as they continued to sting. I frantically swatted at them, killing them one by one, but the damage had already been done. My legs felt like they were on fire. My skin throbbed in waves of pain, and I could feel the swelling already starting. Then the real fear hit me. I was allergic to some kind of stinging insect. I didn't know if it was bees, wasps, or hornets, but if it was hornets, I was screwed. My throat could close up. I could go into anaphylactic shock right there on the trail, alone. I had an EpiPen, but I didn't know if I needed it yet. If I used it and didn't need it, I'd be draining myself of adrenaline I might need later. If I didn't use it and my throat started closing, I wouldn't have time to get it in me before I passed out. To make it worse, I was alone. The other two guys had sprinted off in different directions. I had no idea where they were. My heart was pounding too fast, my breathing was ragged, and I could feel the edges of panic creeping in. My hands started to shake, and before I knew it, I was gasping for air, my vision blurring as my chest tightened. A panic attack. I forced myself to sit. I clenched my fists and closed my eyes, focusing on slowing my breathing. One breath in. Hold it. One breath out. My heart still hammered against my ribs, but slowly, I regained control. I needed to find the rest of the group. I stood up on shaky legs and forced myself forward. Every step sent fresh jolts of pain through my legs. The swelling was getting worse. The skin around the stings felt tight, stretched, almost unnatural. My socks were damp with sweat, but I kept moving. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The pain wasn't getting better, it was getting worse. And that's when it happened again. I stepped forward, and suddenly, the air was alive with movement. A familiar, horrible buzzing sound filled my ears. Another swarm. Before I could even react, they were on me again. The first sting hit the back of my knee, then another on my thigh, then my ankle. I didn't think, I just ran. My pack felt even heavier this time, weighing me down, but I didn't stop. My legs were barely working, but I pushed forward, crashing through the brush, trying to escape. I could barely see through the tears in my eyes. The pain was unbearable. By the time I finally stopped, I collapsed onto the ground. My legs were unrecognizable. The welts had grown into swollen, angry mounds. Some of the stings had started to bleed from where I had scratched at them without thinking. The skin was stretched so tight, I thought it might split open. I broke down. I had never cried like that before. It wasn't just the pain. It was the exhaustion, the fear, the sheer hopelessness of the situation. I was 16, alone in the middle of the woods, covered in venom, and my body was shutting down on me. My legs weren't working right anymore. My muscles felt weak and unsteady. Then the nausea hit. I barely had time to turn to the side before my stomach emptied itself onto the dirt. My throat burned, and my head spun. My body wasn't just in pain, it was rejecting everything. I tried to drink water, but my stomach twisted in protest, and I gagged it back up. I was getting dehydrated fast. Somehow, I kept moving. Every step felt impossible, but I knew stopping meant risking worse. I had to get back to my group. I had to make it. I don't remember much of the next few hours. Everything blurred together into a haze of pain, dehydration, and exhaustion. I must have found my way back, because at some point, I was in camp. Someone helped me. Someone got me water. I think they gave me antihistamines, but it's hard to remember. I didn't quit the trip. I don't know how, but I finished the full 6 days, all 50 miles. By the end, my legs were still swollen, but I could walk. The nausea faded after a couple of days, but the weakness lasted longer. Even after I got home, I felt the effects for weeks. Looking back, I still don't know how I made it through that hike. But I do know one thing, I will never ever go near a hornet's nest again. Hiking the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail had been my dream for as long as I could remember. I had spent years preparing, reading every guide, watching every documentary, and training my body to endure the months of walking, carrying weight, and surviving in the wild. I thought I knew what to expect. I thought I was ready. I wasn't. The things that scared me the most weren't the cold, the exhaustion, or even the wildlife. It was the things I never saw coming. The things that had nothing to do with nature and everything to do with people. It was sometime in Virginia, maybe Glasgow, where I set up camp near a small shelter along the trail. It wasn't an official campground, just one of those spots where hikers naturally gathered for the night. There was a fire ring, some logs to sit on, and enough space for a few tents. I had been hiking alone for most of the day, enjoying the steady rhythm of my boots on the dirt, the quiet of the forest, the way the sun filtered through the leaves. It had been uneventful, just another long day on the trail. As evening settled, I wasn't alone anymore. A few other hikers had arrived, setting up their own camps. Among them were two men who immediately made me uneasy. They were scruffy, unkempt in a way that didn't just say long-distance hiker, but something else, something more desperate. They reeked of alcohol, their clothes stained and torn in ways that suggested they hadn't just been on the trail too long, but had been living like this for far longer. They brought a bottle of something strong to the fire. The smell of burning would mix with the sharp bite of whatever they were drinking. I kept to myself, staying near my tent, but I could hear them talking. It started normal enough, trail stories, complaints about the terrain, jokes about how much their feet hurt. Then slowly it shifted. They started asking me questions, repeating the same one over and over. "How old are you?" I answered once, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to show anything. But they kept asking, like they hadn't heard me, like they didn't care what I said, only that they could keep making me answer. Then the conversation turned darker. One of them started talking about setting a dog on fire. He laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world, like it was just a casual story. The other one started talking about people he knew who had been murdered. He spoke about it too easily, too comfortably, like it was something he thought about often. I stayed quiet. I wasn't alone, though. There were others at the site, including two guys who looked like they could handle themselves, big, strong, the kind of men who carried themselves with confidence. I learned later they were in the army. I kept my distance from the fire, but I didn't leave. I didn't want to make myself look like a target. I just sat there, watching, waiting, keeping my body calm while my mind screamed at me to get away. Eventually, the two men got too drunk to function. They slurred their words, stumbled over their own feet. The tension never fully left, but they were too out of it to be a threat anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my tent, my knife close to my hand, listening to every sound. By morning, they were gone. I don't know where they went. I don't want to know. But I've thought about them every time I've set up camp alone since. The PCT was different from the AT. The terrain, the climate, the sheer scale of it, everything felt bigger, more open, more exposed. I had been hiking through the mountains, pushing through high passes and rocky trails, when I saw something that didn't make sense. Huge black tendrils, curling over the ridge like fingers reaching down toward me. For a split second, my brain couldn't process it. It didn't look like anything I had ever seen before. Then I realized what it was. A dust storm. It was coming fast. I was too high up, too exposed. Running wasn't an option, not all the way to safety. But I had to move, had to get lower, had to find some kind of shelter before it hit. I ran. My pack slammed against my back with every step. My legs burned from the sudden effort. The wind was already picking up, grains of sand stinging my skin, biting into my face. I found a small flat spot and threw down my tent, my hands shaking as I forced the poles into the ground, jamming stakes deep into the dirt. I grabbed rocks, big ones, heavy ones, and placed them inside the tent, on top of the stakes, anywhere I could to weigh it down. The storm was nearly on top of me now, the wind roaring, the sky darkening with dust. I barely managed to crawl inside before it hit. The force of it was like nothing I had ever felt. The entire tent lifted, straining against the weight of me, my pack, and the rocks. The fabric rattled like it was about to tear apart. Sand blasted through the mesh, coating everything. I curled up, arms around my body, waiting for it to end. It didn't. The storm raged all night. The wind never stopped, never lessened, never gave me a break. I could hear things slamming outside, debris flying past. The air inside my tent was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. My throat was dry, my eyes burned, but I couldn't do anything except wait. Somehow my tent survived. By morning, the world outside looked different. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, the ground reshaped by the wind. My tent was battered but intact. I stepped outside, legs shaking, trying to take in what had just happened. It was one of the most brutal nights I had ever spent in the wild. And it wouldn't be the last. Somewhere along the PCT, I got bitten by something. At first, it was just an itchy bump. Nothing to worry about. Then it got worse. The skin around it turned dark, then black. The pain went from an ache to a deep, throbbing agony. I could feel it spreading, the tissue dying, my body fighting against the venom. A brown recluse. It had to be. There was no real treatment out there. No way to stop it. I just had to let my body handle it, had to keep going. The wound oozed, the skin around it peeled away, leaving raw, exposed flesh. Every movement sent new waves of pain through my body, but I had no choice. I had to keep walking. And then came the sunburns. The kind that blister, that make every inch of skin feel like it's being peeled away. The kind that make wearing a pack unbearable, that turn every movement into torture. I don't know how I got through it all, but I did. I finished the trails. And I learned something. Nature is cruel, but it's predictable. You can prepare for storms, for heat, for cold. People are the real danger. And they're the one thing you can never fully prepare for. Hiking alone had never really bothered me before. I had done plenty of solo trips, slept in the woods more times than I could count, and had a decent understanding of what to expect when spending nights away from civilization. But this night in Sweden was different. It wasn't the remoteness of the trail, nor was it the weather or the wildlife. It was something else entirely, something I still have trouble wrapping my head around. I had been hiking for several days already, making my way through the southern part of the country. The trails were well marked, the scenery was beautiful, and the isolation was something I had grown to appreciate. But on this particular day, the weather had taken a turn. The sky was heavy with clouds, and though the rain hadn't started yet, the air carried that thick, damp feeling that warned of an incoming storm. The wind had picked up slightly, making the trees creak as they swayed. I came across one of those wooden weather shelters that were common in Sweden. A simple structure, 3 wooden walls, a slanted roof, and an open front facing the trail. There was a picnic table a few feet in front of it, with a fire pit nearby. It was the kind of place designed for hikers who needed a quick place to rest or wait out bad weather. I decided to stop for the night. It seemed like a good spot, and with the weather looking worse by the hour, it made sense to have some kind of cover. I dropped my pack, stretched my legs, and took a few minutes to check the area. The shelter was empty, and I hadn't seen another person in hours. It was quiet, just the occasional rustling of trees and the distant sounds of water lapping against the shore. I ate a quick meal, drank some water, and settled into my sleeping bag. The ground was firm but dry, and though the wind was still moving through the trees, it felt safe enough. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was staring out at the landscape, the darkening sky turning a deep shade of gray as the moon slowly rose. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on gravel. It took me a second to register where I was. My mind was still foggy with sleep, but the sound was unmistakable, someone walking along the trail. It wasn't the usual light crunch of small animals moving through the underbrush. These were deliberate steps. Slow, measured, the kind of sound that only comes from a person. I kept my breathing steady, trying not to move. My eyes were barely open, just enough to see through the opening of the shelter. The moon was nearly full, casting a soft glow over the clearing. Then I saw him, a shadow moving along the trail, coming closer. I couldn't make out his face, but he was tall, his body outlined against the moonlight. He was walking directly toward the shelter. At first, I assumed it was another hiker. Maybe someone caught in the bad weather, looking for a place to rest. That would have made sense. But as he got closer, something felt off. He wasn't carrying a pack. No gear. Just walking, slow and steady, straight toward me. He stepped right up to the shelter, just a few feet away, and then stopped. For a moment, he stood there, completely still. Then, as if just realizing I was there, he turned and walked over to the picnic table. He sat down on the bench, facing the water. That's when I noticed it. He wasn't wearing any pants. From the waist down, he was completely naked, just sitting there, watching the sea, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. I felt my pulse in my throat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get up and leave, but I forced myself to stay still. He hadn't seen me move yet. Maybe he thought I was asleep. If I stayed quiet, maybe he would just go away. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I kept my eyes half closed, only daring to take small glances at him. He didn't move much, just sat there, staring at the water. I must have drifted off at some point, despite everything in me telling me to stay awake. The next time I woke up, it wasn't because of the man. It was because of a flashlight shining directly in my face. I bolted upright, my heart slamming against my ribs. 3 figures stood in front of the shelter. 2 women and a man, all wearing dark clothing. One of them held the flashlight, the beam blinding me. I squinted, my mind racing. Who the hell were they? They were talking to me, asking questions, but my brain was still trying to catch up. I managed to piece together that they were some kind of private security or civil patrol. Maybe locals who kept an eye on the trails. I told them who I was and what I was doing there. They listened, then nodded and walked away. I should have felt safer after that, but I didn't. I laid back down, my body tense. The flashlight had woken me up, but I didn't know what time it was. Maybe 1 a.m. The moon had shifted, casting long shadows across the clearing. That's when I heard it again. The gravel. Slow footsteps. He was back. I barely breathed, keeping my body as still as possible. My hand moved slowly toward my pack, fingers closing around my small pocket knife. My other hand found my deodorant spray. It wasn't much, but it was something. He was circling the shelter this time, not just walking up to it, moving around it. I heard the crunch of his steps on the gravel, then the softer sound of him stepping onto the grass. He was close, too close. Then silence. I held my breath, straining to hear where he had gone, but there was nothing. I don't know how long I lay there, every muscle in my body locked in place. Maybe he was still there, just out of sight, watching. The hours crawled by. I didn't sleep again. I stayed curled in my sleeping bag, my grip tight around my knife. The only comfort I had was knowing that the sun would rise soon. By 3:30 a.m., the first faint glow appeared on the horizon. The second I saw it, I moved. I packed my gear in record time, my hands shaking. I didn't even stop to eat. As soon as everything was secured, I threw my pack over my shoulder and started walking. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just kept going, putting as much distance between myself and that shelter as I could. Even now, I don't know what his intentions were. Maybe he was just some strange man who liked wandering the woods half-naked. Or maybe it was something worse. I'll never know. But I do know one thing. I won't be sleeping in a weather shelter alone ever again. The desert in Southern California is a place of extremes. High, arid mountains and stretches of land that feel like they belong to a time before humans ever set foot here. I'd been itching for a solo hike, a way to get away from everything and just spend some time in the wild. February was the perfect month. Cold nights that reminded me of the crispness of winter, but temperate days, not too hot and not too cold. It felt like a good time to disappear for a while. I drove for hours to reach the starting point. The trailhead was deep in the desert, about 30 miles in, if you were aiming for the main campgrounds. The roads were winding, rocky, and the scenery around me seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I finally reached the campgrounds, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the land. I set up camp by a mountain stream that trickled through the high desert floor, its path winding between rocks and patches of sparse vegetation. The stream was cold, colder than I expected, but the water, flowing freely from the snowmelt higher up the mountain, was clear and pristine. I could hear the soft sound of it moving over the rocks, like a gentle lullaby. It had been a long day of hiking, so I set about melting some water for cooking and hydration. The fire crackled as the night descended, turning the landscape around me into shadows, but I didn't mind. The night air was chilly, but my gear was good, and the sound of the stream kept me company. As I sat by the fire, I thought about the grime that had built up from the hike. My skin was caked in dirt, and I wanted to rinse off. The water in the stream was inviting, even though it was freezing. I figured it would be a quick, refreshing dip. I grabbed my towel and stripped down, wading into the stream. The shock of the cold water hit immediately, my body tensing up as I sank into the shallow section. The water came up to my waist, a little higher in the middle of the stream. I shivered uncontrollably at first, but the sensation started to numb the edges of my body, and I pushed forward into the current, splashing around a bit to clean off. But then something moved in the water. I felt it before I saw it. A strange shift in the current, the water swirling around something heavy. At first, I thought it might have been a rock or a piece of debris carried downstream. But when I focused my gaze, I saw the shape clearly, a translucent white, undulating mass about 3 to 4 feet long, moving slowly upstream. My stomach dropped. I've hiked in a lot of places, but nothing prepared me for what I was seeing. It didn't look like any fish I'd ever encountered. It was too big, too long. And it wasn't behaving like any fish either. It wasn't darting around. It wasn't swimming in a predictable pattern. It was moving slowly, steadily, almost as though it was pushing against the current. I froze. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to notice me at first. Or at least, it didn't seem to care. But that didn't make it any less unsettling. The water around it shifted with each movement, the shape undulating, as though it were alive, and whatever it was too big to be anything familiar. I had seen plenty of wildlife in my time, but nothing like this. Instinct kicked in. I turned to leave the water, my feet fumbling on the slippery rocks beneath me. But the cold had numbed my legs, and as I tried to climb out of the stream, my shins and knees collided with the jagged rocks lining the bank. The pain was sharp and sudden, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to get out, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I finally pulled myself up onto the bank, panting. The water splashed around my ankles as I stumbled back, my heart still racing. I didn't stop to look back. I just moved, stumbling over the uneven ground, my mind barely keeping up with my body. When I reached the safety of the campsite, I sat down, my heart still hammering in my chest. I didn't dare look back toward the water, not even as I grabbed my gear. My knees were scraped up, blood mixing with the dirt, but it didn't matter. All I could think about was what I had just seen. I didn't say anything to anyone else on the trail when I returned to the campgrounds later that evening. They wouldn't have believed me. They never do when you're alone out here. It's always easy to dismiss things when you're not the one who saw them. They'd probably just tell me I was seeing things, or that the cold water had messed with my head. But I knew what I saw, and I wasn't about to go back near that stream to figure out what it was. The night went on, cold and quiet. I stayed by the fire as much as I could, barely able to keep my eyes open, my thoughts spinning in circles. I wasn't tired, not exactly. But I was uneasy, and no matter how much I told myself it was all in my head, that thing in the stream kept replaying itself. By morning, the cold had seeped deep into my bones. The sky was pale blue, and the sun was just beginning to rise over the mountains. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, barely touching the water or the stream again. I heard the sounds of the desert around me, the calls of birds, the rustling of the wind, and the distant rumble of the mountains. But there was no sound coming from the stream. The current was still, unnervingly still, and the water looked almost placid, as though it were hiding something beneath its surface. I didn't stay long. I knew I wouldn't be camping by that stream again. I left the campgrounds with as much speed as I could muster, my feet eager to put distance between myself and the water. I don't know what that thing was in the stream. It wasn't a snake. It wasn't a fish. And it definitely wasn't anything I could identify as native to the area. I didn't want to think about it too much, but I couldn't help myself. Something about it wasn't right, and I felt a chill every time I thought about it. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was fully up, and the desert was starting to warm up, but I wasn't taking any chances. I kept my eyes peeled, scanning the rocks and the brush around me. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some strange creature that I couldn't identify. But that thing in the stream, that's something I'll never forget. The memory still lingers. And every time I go hiking in that area, even if I'm miles away from that stream, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching from the water just below the surface, waiting. The lake was still. We had paddled for most of the day, making our way through a long, narrow stretch of water that cut between thick, untouched forest. The canoe was heavy with gear, packs, food, tent, but we had made good time, choosing a campsite about halfway down the lake, a small clearing just off the shore. It was perfect. A flat patch of ground, enough space for the tent, and a little opening between the trees that gave us a clear view of the water. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, the fire was going, and the quiet settled in. The kind of silence you only find deep in the woods, where the world shrinks down to just you, the trees, and the dark water stretching out in front of you. It always takes a little while to adjust to it, to let go of the noise of daily life and just listen. The crackling of the fire, the lapping of the water against the shore, the occasional rustling in the trees. You remind yourself it's just the wind or a small animal, and not something watching from the shadows. We cooked, ate, cleaned up, and let the fire burn down to embers before calling it a night. My wife climbed into the tent first, and I stayed up a little longer, enjoying the quiet, staring out over the lake. The moon was up, but not full, just a dim glow behind a thin layer of clouds. After a while, I decided to wash up before turning in. I walked down to the edge of the lake, crouching at the waterline, and splashed the cold water onto my face. It shocked me awake for a moment, that sharp bite of mountain-fed water, but it felt good, refreshing. Then I looked up. 2 small lights were across the lake. Headlamps. 50 meters wasn't far, not even a full paddle's length in the canoe, but it was dark enough that I could only make out those 2 little pinpricks of light moving slowly through the trees. The fact that anyone else was out here surprised me. We had seen no signs of other campers all day. No canoes, no distant campfire smoke. And yet there they were. They were moving, but not fast. Hesitant, almost uncertain. I watched for a while, wondering what they were doing. They would stop for long moments, then the lights would bob and shift, then stop again. It didn't seem like they were setting up camp, more like they were looking for something. Then suddenly the lights died. Just gone. No dimming, no flickering, just an abrupt and total blackness. I waited. Sometimes people turn their lamps off to save battery. Maybe they were climbing into their tent for the night. Maybe they had just reached their site and were getting settled. Then I heard it. A deep, heavy snorting. Loud. Too loud to be the wind. Too forceful to be some small animal. Something big was over there. The sound came again. A deep exhale through wide nostrils, followed by the sharp crunch of something moving through the brush. A moose. Or worse. My stomach tightened. I knew that moose could be unpredictable, especially during the rut, and bears. Well, bears were always a concern in the backcountry. The sound had come from the same area where I had just seen the lights. They weren't moving anymore. I swallowed, then called out across the water. "Hey, are you all right?" Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the lights. Maybe I had let the quiet get to me, let my mind turn a normal forest sound into something worse. Then, from across the lake, movement. A voice, faint but real, calling back. They had taken the wrong trail. I listened, piecing the story together from the broken, distant words drifting across the water. They had started at the wrong parking lot, had hiked for hours in the dark, and when they finally reached the lake, they had gone down the wrong side. And now they were trapped. No lights, no way to set up camp, and something big moving nearby. I turned and looked at our canoe, pulled up onto the shore. The thought of getting back on the water in the dark didn't thrill me. Lakes at night are different. Depthless, black, full of nothing and everything at the same time. But I knew what they were facing. It could take them hours to hike to the next campsite, if they even knew where it was. And without headlamps, stumbling through the trees in the pitch black with a moose or a bear nearby. That wasn't an option. I grabbed my paddle. The lake was so calm it barely made a sound as I slid the canoe into the water. My breath sounded too loud in the stillness as I stepped in and pushed off. The moment I left the shore, I felt it, that familiar unease of floating over deep water in total darkness. The blackness below me felt bottomless, like anything could be down there. I gripped my paddle and moved fast, my eyes locked on the opposite shore. The snorting sound came again, closer now. A large shape moved through the brush, but I couldn't see what it was. I could only hear it. Heavy steps, snapping twigs. When I reached the shore, 2 figures were waiting. They looked exhausted. I handed them my spare flashlight and steadied the canoe as they climbed in. They moved carefully, but the canoe still rocked under the shifting weight. I didn't want to think about what would happen if we tipped. I pushed off, and we drifted back into the center of the lake. From the darkness behind us, another loud exhale. Whatever it was, it had been close. No one spoke as we crossed the water. The only sound was the quiet dip of my paddle and the occasional lapping of water against the hull. The moment we reached the shore, they scrambled out, dragging their packs with them. They were relieved, grateful. I stayed up while they set up their tent, my flashlight beam cutting through the trees as they worked. By the time they were settled, I felt the exhaustion settle into my bones. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me heavy, slow. I climbed back into my own tent, pulling my sleeping bag tight around me. The lake was silent again. The woods were as they had been before. But I didn't sleep for a long time. All I could think about was how close they had been to spending the night lost in the dark, with something big breathing just outside the trees. I had been hiking for over 2 hours, and I was soaked in sweat. The August sun pressed down on me, and the air felt thick, unmoving. The heat clung to my skin, made worse by the long pants I had stubbornly worn. I knew better, knew it would be miserable, knew I'd overheat, but I had read too many warnings about ticks in the tall grass. And the grass was everywhere. Golden waves of it, stretching up past my knees on either side of the faint, barely there trail. It swayed gently in the occasional breeze that never seemed to reach me. The trail was an old herding path, rough and unmarked, winding through a remote stretch of wilderness I had hiked a few times before. Not an official route, not even a maintained one, just a barely visible track that wove through dense spruce forest and followed the course of a slow-moving stream. It was beautiful, untouched, the kind of place you could walk for miles without seeing another person. That was part of the reason I had chosen it. I had no friends in the area, and I liked it that way. I had moved out here fresh out of college, craving space, quiet. Out here, no one knew me. No one expected anything from me. It was just me in the woods. But right now, I was roasting alive. The trail dipped down toward the stream, and I caught glimpses of it through the trees, dark, glassy water edged with green, slow-moving and inviting. I could hear it, too, the quiet trickle of water rolling over smooth stones, the occasional splash of something moving beneath the surface. It looked incredible. I kept walking, pushing farther into no man's land, until I reached a bend in the river. It was perfect. The trees opened up here, revealing a shallow bank of smooth, water-worn rocks. The grass thinned out, giving way to softer earth. The river itself widened, deepened. It was shaded, cool. I stood there for a while, breathing hard, sweat dripping down my back, and finally gave in. I wasn't worried about anyone stumbling upon me. No one hiked this far out. No one knew about this trail. So I stripped, peeled off my shirt, my pants, everything, and stepped into the water. The shock was immediate. The river was mountain-fed, which meant the water was ice-cold, even in the peak of summer. It hit me like a slap, a sudden gasp escaping my throat as I pushed deeper. But the relief was instant. The heat vanished, replaced by the sharp, almost painful chill of the water swallowing me whole. I let it happen, let it pull the heat from my skin, and for the first time all day, I felt good. I stood there for a while, chest deep, letting my body adjust, listening to the quiet. The forest around me was still, the occasional bird call breaking the silence. Somewhere upstream, a branch snapped, but I ignored it. Probably just a deer. Then I got curious. I had never gone past this bend in the river. The trail veered away from the water shortly after this point, cutting through thicker forest. But I had always wondered what was around the corner, what lay just out of sight. And right now, I was already in the water. I was already wet. So I waded forward. The river deepened slightly as I moved, reaching up to my collarbones. The rocks under my feet were slick, forcing me to take slow, careful steps. I barely made a sound. I reached the bend and peered around it. More spruce trees. More water. A large, smooth boulder resting half-submerged near the shore. And next to it, a bull moose. He was massive, easily over 1,000 pounds, with long, knotted legs and a thick, heavy body. His antlers rose like bare tree branches above his head, still covered in the soft, velvety fuzz of summer growth. His coat was dark brown, nearly black, slick with water. He was drinking. His huge head dipped down, his broad snout breaking the surface, sending tiny ripples through the otherwise motionless water. And he hadn't seen me. I froze. I was no more than 50 feet from him, completely naked, standing in chest-deep water with nowhere to go. Moose are unpredictable. People always worry about bears, but moose kill more people each year. They're huge, fast, and aggressive when they want to be. And right now, I was too close. Way too close. Panic surged through me. My breath caught in my throat. My body tensed, ready to move, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Not fast. I had to get out of here. Slowly, I turned in the water. I moved as carefully as I could, each step a calculated shift, trying not to create ripples, trying not to make a sound. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. Every time I exhaled, the words slipped out under my breath. I don't want to die. It became a rhythm, a quiet chant, a desperate, whispered plea. The water felt endless, the distance to shore stretching farther than it had been before. I fought the urge to bolt. I fought the instinct screaming at me to move faster. I kept going. And then, a splash. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it was him. I reached the shallows, my feet hitting solid ground, and I ran. I ran straight out of the water, through the trees, through the thick underbrush, completely naked, feet slipping over moss and dirt. Branches clawed at my skin, burrs clung to my legs. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I didn't stop. I ran until I couldn't hear the water anymore, until my lungs burned and my legs ached. I stopped just long enough to pull on my underwear and my shoes. Screw the rest, I needed to move. I kept going, didn't slow down, didn't look back. The woods felt different now. The quiet that had once been peaceful was now suffocating, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting. Every snapped twig, every rustling leaf sent another jolt of panic through me. I just needed to get back to my car. I pushed forward, lungs aching, every muscle screaming at me to stop. Finally, I saw it. The car was still there, parked where I had left it. I reached it, yanked the door open, and collapsed into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I sat there for a long time, heart racing, staring at the empty road ahead. The silence of the woods pressed against the windows, thick and heavy. Eventually, the shaking stopped. Eventually, my breathing slowed. And eventually, I started to laugh. It was shaky, breathless. More out of relief than anything. I had just gone skinny, dipping with a bull moose in the middle of the wilderness. And somehow, I had made it out. I had been looking forward to this hike for a while. It was supposed to be an easy one, just a simple out-and-back trail that followed along a river, with a few spots where you could cross over to a nearby road if needed. I was with a group of co-workers, most of whom I didn't know very well, but we had all agreed it would be a nice way to get outside and enjoy the weather. The trail itself wasn't too remote, which is why it had seemed like such a good idea in the first place. The river was always close by, and if something went wrong, the road was never too far away. It felt safe, familiar, until it didn't. We had started hiking in the late morning, and everything was going fine. The trail was shaded by a thick canopy of trees, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. The river ran alongside us, sometimes close enough to touch, sometimes a little ways off through the trees. It wasn't too loud, just a constant background noise that mixed in with the sound of our footsteps and the occasional laughter from the group. The trail itself was well-worn, mostly dirt with a few sections of exposed rock where the river had eroded the ground away. Every now and then, we'd pass a crossing, a narrow stretch where you could step across some rocks or use a fallen log to get to the other side and take a shortcut to the road. At some point, I stopped to adjust my boot. The rest of the group kept moving, lost in their conversations, not realizing I had fallen behind. I wasn't worried about it. The trail was straightforward, and I could still hear their voices not too far ahead. I tightened my laces, stood up, and kept walking. I figured I'd catch up in just a minute or two. That's when I saw the truck. It was parked just off the trail, too close to be accidental. Someone had driven it right up to the edge, past where any normal person would have stopped. It was an older model, dark green, covered in dirt like it had been on a lot of back roads. The hood was still warm, and the windows were rolled down. A man was leaning against the driver's side door, watching me. He was dressed like any other hiker, cargo pants, a long-sleeved shirt, hiking boots. He had a baseball cap pulled low over his face, and a short beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in a while. He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, but something about the way he was just standing there, waiting, made my skin crawl. "Hey there," he said. His voice was casual, friendly even. "Out for a hike?" I nodded, not really wanting to engage, but not wanting to be outright rude either. He kept talking, asking me how my day was going, if I was enjoying the trail. Just small talk, but something about the way he kept looking past me, scanning the trail behind me, made me uneasy. I realized that from where he was standing, he couldn't see the rest of my group. For all he knew, I really was alone. "You hiking by yourself?" he asked. His tone was still light, but the question sent a spike of adrenaline through me. I shook my head. "No, I'm with some people." He nodded slowly, like he was thinking that over. "Funny though, I don't see anybody." I forced a smile, trying to act casual. "They're just up ahead." He kept looking behind me, then back at me. You just seem kinda alone out here." The way he said it made my stomach twist. It wasn't just an observation, it was a statement, a reminder. I was alone, at least for the moment, and he wanted me to know that he knew it. I gripped the straps of my backpack a little tighter, forcing myself to stay calm. I had to act normal, act like nothing was wrong. He sighed, shaking his head like he had just remembered something. "Hey, you ever hear of the local hiking club?" I didn't answer. "Yeah, great group," he continued. "I got a business card somewhere in my truck. You should check it out." He gestured toward the passenger side. "You want to come help me find it?" Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. I forced another smile, trying to keep my voice light. "No thanks, I think my group is close." The air felt thick, like everything had slowed down. He didn't move at first, just kept looking at me. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, from somewhere up the trail, a dog barked. It was my coworker's dog. I had never been so relieved to hear anything in my life. A second later, the dog came bounding up the trail, tail wagging, and I heard voices coming closer. I turned without another word and started walking fast, not running, but close to it. My heart was pounding, so hard I thought I might throw up. I didn't look back. When I caught up to my group, I stayed in the middle of them for the rest of the hike. I didn't say anything about what had happened, not right away. I felt stupid, paranoid, like maybe I had overreacted. Maybe he really had just been socially awkward. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The way he had kept pointing out how alone I was. The way he had tried to get me to come to his truck. The way he had watched me waiting. When we got back to the parking lot, I glanced around, half expecting to see his truck again. It was gone. I never saw him again, but I stopped hiking that trail alone after that. And every time I go hiking now, I pay more attention to who's around me, who's watching, and how easy it is sometimes to find yourself completely alone. Hiking at night has always had a certain draw for me. The solitude, the crisp air, the way everything feels amplified in the dark. It's a whole different world compared to hiking in daylight. Sounds carry further, movements in the shadows seem bigger than they are, and the stillness gets into your head. I like to think of myself as someone who doesn't spook easily, but that night, I learned that fear can creep in, even when you know exactly where you are and what you're doing. It was early February in Colorado, deep winter, but without snow on the ground. The air was cool but not freezing, a perfect night for hiking. I had decided to take a familiar trail, one I had walked dozens of times in daylight. It wound through a narrow gulch, steep-walled and rocky, with dense brush and trees along the sides. There was no wind that night, which made the silence heavy. Every step I took crunched slightly on the dirt and gravel path, the sound bouncing off the walls and coming back to me. I had a good flashlight, not the weak kind that barely lights the ground in front of you. This one was strong, cutting through the dark and letting me see details clearly. I moved carefully, as I always did at night, my footsteps measured and deliberate. Despite the lack of wind, the cold settled in my clothes, wrapping around me as I moved deeper into the gulch. I was about halfway through my hike when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a distant, wailing sound that barely registered over the silence. I stopped, thinking maybe it was an animal, maybe even the wind shifting, except there was no wind. I stayed still, listening, and it came again. A cry, but not just any cry. It sounded human. It was high-pitched, like someone screaming at the top of their lungs, but muffled in a way that made it even more disturbing. There was a shrillness to it, a desperation. My first thought was that someone was in trouble, but something about the sound was off. It didn't sound like a person screaming for help, not exactly. It sounded wrong. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but the beam only lit up the trees and rocks. Nothing moved. The sound came again, and now I could tell it wasn't far. Maybe 100 feet away, maybe less. My skin prickled. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. Not mine. Not light, rustling movements like a rabbit or a raccoon. These had weight. Slow, deliberate. Something was moving nearby, something bigger than I was comfortable with. The crunch of gravel and twigs underfoot made my stomach drop. I stayed frozen, trying to calm my breathing, listening. The cry came again, loud and echoing through the gulch, and at the same time, I heard the footsteps shift. They were closer. I aimed my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but the beam caught nothing but trees and rocks. Whatever it was just out of sight. I took a step back. My instincts were screaming at me to move, but I forced myself to stay still to assess. I knew this area. I knew the animals here. Nothing I was familiar with made a sound like that. I swallowed hard. Another step back. The crunch beneath my feet seemed too loud, like it might give me away. Then another cry. Louder. Closer. My body tensed. My mind was caught between two conflicting thoughts. Run or figure out what the hell was making that noise. The footsteps shifted again. Whatever it wasn't running toward me, but it wasn't backing off either. It was moving, circling, staying close enough that I could hear it but not see it. My heart pounded. This wasn't right. I had to leave. I turned and walked, forcing myself not to run. Running would make noise, could attract attention. I kept my pace steady, my flashlight aimed ahead, my ears straining for every sound behind me. The crying noise continued, but I didn't turn back. I didn't care what it was anymore. I just needed to get out of the gulch. The walk back felt longer than it should have. My legs were tense, every step controlled. I expected to hear footsteps chasing me, to feel something rush up behind me, but it never happened. The crying noise faded as I put distance between myself and the source, but I didn't feel relief. Not yet. I reached my car and got in quickly, locking the doors out of instinct, even though I was alone in the middle of nowhere. My hands were shaking. My breath was unsteady. I sat there for a long moment, flashlight still clutched in my grip, staring at the dark trailhead. When I finally started my car and pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there watching, following. When I got home, I couldn't let it go. I needed to know. I started searching online. Cry for help scream at night, Colorado animal screams, screaming animal sounds in the dark. Then I found it. A red fox. The sound I had heard was almost exactly like the mating call of a red fox. I played the clip over and over, feeling the weight in my chest slowly ease. That was it. That had to be it. The footsteps, though. That was the part one couldn't explain. Maybe it was my own fear making me hear things. Maybe the stillness of the night amplified normal sounds, made them seem closer. Maybe I imagined the weight behind them. But I know what I heard, and I don't think I imagined it. My wife and I had been planning our road trip to the Pacific Northwest for months. We both loved the outdoors, and there was something about the dense, misty forests and rugged coastline that drew us in. It felt wild, untamed, and completely different from the flat plains we were used to. We loaded up the car with our gear, packed plenty of food, and hit the road. The drive itself was long but enjoyable. We took our time, stopping at small diners and scenic overlooks. It was supposed to be a trip to disconnect from everything. No emails, no phone calls, just the two of us and the wilderness. The trip was going smoothly until, somewhere along the way, we started hearing reports about a woman who had gone missing in a national park. Later, we learned that her boyfriend had killed her. It was all over the news. The story was horrifying, and it made the wilderness feel different, less like a peaceful escape, and more like something that could swallow you whole. Still, we had already planned our hike deep into the forest, and we weren't going to let the news change our plans. We arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, just as the sun was rising. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in the air. The forest stretched out in front of us, endless and dark in some places, bright and golden where the sun filtered through the trees. We strapped on our backpacks, adjusted our gear, and set off. The trail was well-worn but not overly crowded. Occasionally, we passed other hikers, but for the most part, it felt like we had the place to ourselves. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, exactly what we had wanted. About 5 miles in, the trail started to narrow, winding through dense underbrush. The trees were thicker here, their trunks towering high above us, blocking out much of the sky. The light took on a strange, muted quality, almost like dusk, even though it was still midday. It was then that we heard it. A scream. It was distant, echoing through the trees, but unmistakably human. A sharp, high-pitched wail that sent a chill down my spine. My wife stopped in her tracks, and I could see the fear in her eyes. We listened, straining to hear anything else, but the forest had gone silent. Then another scream. This time it was closer. It wasn't just the distance that had changed, it sounded different. More guttural, more desperate. My mind immediately jumped to the news story. A woman had been murdered in a place just like this. What if this was happening again? What if someone was out here, injured or worse? We stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and head back to the car, but another part of me felt a responsibility to make sure no one was in danger. I hesitated for only a few seconds before deciding to move forward, slowly, cautiously. My wife followed close behind, gripping my arm tightly. We walked another few yards when the scream came again, but this time, it came from a different direction. My stomach dropped. That didn't make sense. It had been straight ahead of us a moment ago. Now it was to the right. Then, almost immediately, another scream sounded from behind us. That was impossible. A wave of cold panic spread through my body. My wife grabbed my wrist so hard that her nails dug into my skin. We weren't alone out here. And whatever was making those sounds, it was moving. Fast. I didn't say anything, didn't even have to. We turned and started walking back the way we had come, quickening our pace with each step. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone emerging from the trees. But there was nothing, just dense forest and shadows. The screams kept coming, bouncing through the trees, sometimes distant, sometimes impossibly close. It was like the forest itself was alive, throwing sound around in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. My heart was pounding. My wife was breathing hard beside me, her grip never loosening. Then suddenly it stopped. The forest was silent again, except for our hurried footsteps on the dirt path. No screams, no movement, just eerie, suffocating stillness. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to keep going. It wasn't until we were nearly back to the trailhead that we finally saw another group of hikers. I was so relieved to see them that I almost laughed. We slowed down, trying to compose ourselves, not wanting to look like we had just run for our lives. As we passed them, I heard one of them mention something about elk. My mind was still racing, so I barely registered it at first. Later, back at the car, I finally pulled out my phone and searched for sounds elk make. And there it was. The same high-pitched, almost human-like wail. It was called bugling, a sound bull elk make during the rut to attract females and challenge other males. I let out a long breath and looked over at my wife. She was staring at the screen, listening to the recording, then back at me. We had been terrified out of our minds by a group of elk. I let out a small, nervous laugh. My wife didn't laugh, not at first, but after a few seconds, she exhaled sharply and shook her head. We sat in silence for a long moment before finally pulling out of the parking lot. The fear had been real, but looking back, it seemed almost ridiculous. Almost. Because in that moment, in the middle of the forest, when the sounds had surrounded us and our minds had convinced us of something far worse, it hadn't felt ridiculous at all. It had felt like something was hunting us. Even now, when I think back on that trip, I don't feel embarrassed about how we reacted. It's easy to rationalize fear when you're safe. But out there, deep in the woods, with the trees closing in and the screams echoing around us, it didn't matter what was logical. All that mattered was getting out. And we did. That was enough for me. I had been planning this trip for a while, wanting to squeeze in one last backcountry camping trip before winter set in. It was late in the season, and I knew that my current gear setup wouldn't handle snow and freezing temperatures well. The valley I had in mind wasn't well traveled this time of year, which was exactly why I wanted to go. I'd be alone, isolated, completely away from people before winter forced me back into civilization. The plan was simple: hike into the valley, set up camp, and then take a side trip to a couple of alpine lakes a few kilometers away. It wasn't an easy route, but I had studied my map and felt confident about the terrain. The lakes were off-trail, requiring some scrambling and bushwhacking, but nothing I hadn't done before. I got a late start, mostly because I got a little too ambitious on my way in. There were some viewpoints I wanted to check out, and I took my time. By the time I finally arrived at my campsite, the sun was already starting to sink lower in the sky. The valley was quiet, and as expected, I was the only one there. At least for now. There were occasional grizzly warnings in this area, and although I hadn't seen any sign of bears, I didn't want to waste any time. I set up my tent quickly, made sure my food was properly stored, and then grabbed a small pack for the hike to the lakes. I had maybe an hour and a half of good light left before dusk. The first part of the route was easy. There was a faint trail, likely used by animals more than people, but it disappeared after about 15 minutes. After that, I was just moving through the woods, picking my way through brush and over fallen logs. The climb up to the lakes would be steep, but nothing too technical. I called out frequently as I hiked, a habit I'd picked up in bear country. Hey ho! Just to make my presence known. If there was a bear ahead, I wanted it to hear me before I stumbled right into it. The last thing I wanted was to surprise a grizzly. About a kilometer from the lakes, I called out again. Hey ho! And then I heard it back. Hey ho! It was a woman's voice. Loud, clear, and close. It sounded like she was right behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks. My brain scrambled to process what I'd just heard. I turned around instantly, expecting to see someone there. But there was no one. Nothing but trees and fading light. I stood there listening. My breathing was heavy, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, expecting to hear footsteps, movement, anything. But there was nothing. Just silence. I felt my stomach drop. My first instinct was that someone else was out here, but that didn't make sense. There were no other cars at the trailhead when I arrived, and anyone coming into this part of the valley would have had to pass through the campsite or take a very difficult route over the mountains. I waited a little longer, scanning the trees, expecting someone to step out from the brush. Maybe a solo hiker like me, maybe someone playing a joke. But no one appeared. I debated turning back right then and there. Every instinct in me was screaming that something was off. But I had come this far, and I was so close to the lakes. I pushed forward, moving quickly, my senses on high alert. I checked over my shoulder frequently, but I never saw anyone. I reached the lakes in record time, but I barely took them in. Normally, I would have spent some time exploring, maybe taken a break to enjoy the view. But I felt too exposed, too unsettled. The last of the light was draining from the sky, and I didn't want to be out here in the dark. I turned around and practically ran back down the slope. Every rustling branch, every snapped twig had me spinning around, expecting to see someone there. But I never did. By the time I reached my campsite, it was nearly dark. My breathing was heavy, and my hands were shaking as I fumbled with my headlamp. To my relief, a few other campers had arrived while I was gone. 2 tents were set up nearby, and a couple of people were moving around with their headlamps on. I forced myself to calm down. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my own voice had echoed in a strange way. I wanted to believe that. The other campers were friendly enough, but when I asked if any of them had been out in the woods near the lakes, they all shook their heads. They had arrived only an hour ago, and they hadn't seen anyone else on the way in. In fact, part of their hike was along a ridge that overlooked the forest, and they would have seen anyone moving through it. That left me with only one explanation. Whoever had called back to me had either left the valley completely or was still out there, somewhere in the dark. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside my tent had me wide awake, my hand on my knife, my body tense. But nothing happened. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I had planned to stay another night, but I wasn't comfortable anymore. I didn't want to spend another evening looking over my shoulder. The hike out was uneventful, and when I reached my car, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But as I drove away, I kept thinking about that voice, about how close it had sounded, about how, even though I had looked, I had never seen anyone. I don't have an explanation for what happened. Maybe there was another hiker out there, someone passing through at the exact moment I was. But if there was, they must have left in total darkness, without a headlamp, without ever making another sound. I've been on a lot of solo trips, but I haven't been back to that valley since. The air was crisp that morning as I parked my car and got my 2 dogs ready for the hike. It was a simple 3-mile loop around the lake, something we had done dozens of times before. The lake trail was one of my favorite spots, quiet, peaceful, and usually empty except for the occasional jogger or fisherman on the banks. The water was still, reflecting the trees that lined the shore, their autumn leaves beginning to scatter onto the dirt path. The morning sun peeked through the branches, casting long shadows across the trail as we started walking. Toby, my black lab, trotted dutifully beside me, his big brown eyes scanning our surroundings. He was always calm, steady, and obedient. My golden retriever, Charlie, had a different personality. Curious, always sniffing, tail wagging, ears perking up at every little rustle in the leaves. They balanced each other out, and I always felt safe with them, even when walking alone. The trail was peaceful, just the crunch of my boots against the dirt and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake. A slight breeze stirred the leaves, sending a soft rustling through the trees. It was one of those moments where everything felt perfectly normal, like any other hike we had done before. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just enjoying the walk, the fresh air, and the time with my dogs. About halfway through the loop, the trail narrowed slightly as it curved around a thicker patch of woods. That's when I saw him, a jogger, coming toward me from the opposite direction. He wasn't running anymore, just walking at a quick pace, his breathing a little heavy. As he got closer, something about him felt off. His clothes were normal, running shorts, a sweat-wicking shirt, sneakers, but there was something about the way he moved that made me instinctively grip Toby's leash a little tighter. "Hey," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I think I'm lost. Can you tell me how to get back to the parking lot?" I glanced around, making sure I had heard him right. This was a loop. No matter which way he went, he would eventually end up at the parking lot. "You can go either way," I said, motioning with my hand. "It's a loop. Just keep going and you'll get there." He hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "But which way is faster?" I frowned a little. "It doesn't really matter. It's about the same distance either way." He stepped a little closer. Toby, who had been sitting patiently by my side, suddenly went very still. Charlie, uninterested in the conversation, had wandered off to sniff at some leaves a few feet away. The man nodded slowly, but he didn't move. "So just keep going." I nodded. "Yeah, just follow the trail." He took another step toward me. It wasn't a big step, but it was close enough that I felt uncomfortable. That's when Toby let out a growl. Not a low, uncertain growl, but something deep, serious. A warning. It startled me because Toby never growled. He was the kind of dog who would let a toddler yank on his ears and not even flinch. But this growl was different. It was clear, controlled, and firm. It wasn't just a random noise. It had a message. Don't take another step. The jogger's face changed immediately. He lifted his hands, palms out, and took a step back. All right, he said, and then, without another word, he turned and jogged off fast. Faster than I expected. I stood there, watching until he was completely out of sight. My heart was pounding. I hadn't realized how tense I was until he was gone. I knelt down and scratched Toby behind the ears, murmuring praise. "Good boy," I said, my voice a little shaky. "Good boy, Toby." Charlie trotted back over, oblivious, sniffing at Toby's face like he was trying to figure out what he had missed. But Toby was still watching the trail, his ears perked, his body alert. I exhaled slowly and turned in the opposite direction. I didn't want to keep walking in the same direction as that man. I walked fast, keeping a tight grip on both leashes, my senses on high alert. Every rustle in the leaves, every creak of a branch, I noticed everything. The peaceful walk had turned into something else. By the time I made it back to my car, I was still feeling uneasy. I scanned the parking lot, checking for the jogger, but I didn't see him. I opened the car door, let the dogs jump in, and sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly. I was safe. Everything was fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong about that encounter. I thought about all the ways it could have gone differently if Toby hadn't been there. If he hadn't growled. If I hadn't had my dogs with me at all. I didn't know what that man's intentions were, and I didn't want to. But the moment Toby had made it clear that one more step was a bad idea, the man had backed off. I looked over at Toby, who was now sprawled out in the back seat like nothing had happened. I reached back and gave him another scratch behind the ears. "Good boy," I said again, softer this time. I started the car and drove home, grateful for my dog, grateful that I had trusted my instincts, and grateful that whatever might have happened didn't. I don't typically get creeped out. I've spent a lot of time outdoors, hiking in remote areas, camping miles away from civilization, and I've never been the type to let my imagination get the best of me. But one summer day, my wife and I went on a hike, and something about that trail felt different. It was subtle at first, just a feeling in my gut, something I could have ignored. But then my wife mentioned she felt uneasy too. That was when I started really paying attention. It was a warm afternoon, and we had picked a well-known but lightly traveled trail. It wasn't the most remote place we had hiked, but it was far enough out that we didn't expect to see many people. The forest was dense here, thick with pines and underbrush that made it impossible to see far beyond the trail. The sunlight filtered through the trees in shifting patterns, and the air smelled of warm pine needles and earth. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. At first, I brushed it off as just a passing thought. Maybe I was just feeling off for no reason. just one of those days. But as we walked, I noticed that the usual forest sounds had died down. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just silence, except for the sound of our footsteps crunching against the dirt path. My wife noticed it too. She wasn't the type to get spooked easily either, but I saw the tension in her face, the way she kept glancing into the trees as we walked. I stopped for a moment, listening. Nothing. No wind, no movement, just an oppressive, heavy stillness. Something was wrong. "Let's pick up the pace," I said, keeping my voice steady, not wanting to alarm her more than she already was. She nodded. We turned around and started walking faster, not quite running, but enough to cover ground quickly. The uneasy feeling wasn't going away. In fact, the further we went, the stronger it got. My back felt exposed. I had that creeping sensation you get when you know someone is watching you, except I couldn't see anyone. A little ways down the trail, we came across a woman walking with her dog. The dog, a medium-sized mutt, had its ears pinned back and was sticking close to her legs. She slowed as we approached, giving us a quick, uncertain look before asking, "Have you seen any wildlife up there?" The way she said it told me she already knew something was off. Her dog was acting strangely, clearly picking up on something in the area. I just shook my head, not wanting to stay and chat. We kept moving, and the feeling of unease never left. I couldn't shake the thought that something had been watching us from the trees, hidden just out of sight. Mountain lions were known to stalk people without them ever realizing it until it was too late. Maybe that was what had been there, silently observing, waiting for the right moment. We made it back to the car without incident, but the feeling lingered. Even as we drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just paranoia. But I've never ignored my instincts before, and I don't think I imagined the way the forest had gone silent. Somewhere out there, hidden in the trees, something had been watching us. And whatever it was, it had stayed just out of sight, patient, waiting. We never went back to that trail. I used to hike this trail once a week near my college. It was my go-to escape from classes and the stress of assignments. It wasn't an easy hike, especially at the beginning. The first mile was all uphill, winding through thick woods with little openings in the canopy. The climb burned my legs every time, but I pushed through because I knew what came after. A gradual decline with stunning views, rolling hills stretching out, and a creek bed that led me back to the parking lot. It was always worth the effort. I had a ritual when I reached the top. There was a large, flat rock overlooking a deep gully. I'd sit down, catch my breath, and take in the view. The air was always cooler up there, the wind cutting through the trees, making everything feel peaceful. It was my reward for the climb. One day, after resting as usual, I stood up and started walking down the path. Almost immediately, something felt off. It wasn't pain or exhaustion. It was something deeper, like my body was telling me not to go any further. I paused, trying to shake the feeling. I wasn't used to anything unsettling on this hike. It had always felt like a safe place, familiar, predictable. I decided to step back to my resting spot, and just like that, the feeling vanished. That was weird. Maybe I needed to catch my breath a little longer. I waited a bit, then started walking again. I got a little further down the trail, maybe 20 or 30 yards, before the feeling came back. This time, it was stronger. A cold, creeping dread spread through me, and I felt an overwhelming sense that I was being watched. Not just that uneasy paranoia when you're alone in the woods, but something sharper, more certain. I stopped in my tracks, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just spooked for no reason. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake it. I turned around and headed back the way I came, walking fast but steady. The feeling didn't go away. It followed me the entire way down the mountain. The whole descent, I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, listening for movement. Nothing. No sounds beyond the usual rustling leaves and chirping birds. No sign of anything unusual. But the feeling never left. When I reached the parking lot, I turned to look back up the trail. I still saw nothing. The second I got inside my car, though, I felt completely fine. Safe. It was like something had lifted the moment I was inside. I turned the car on and left, but the unease stuck with me. I knew, without a doubt, that if I had continued down that trail that day, something bad would have happened. I don't know what, but I wasn't about to find out. Years later, I had a similar experience in the Wichita Mountains of Oklahoma. It was a rugged area, full of rocky outcrops, rolling plains, and scattered trees. I had gone out there to explore for the day, picking trails at random, climbing over boulders, and pushing further into areas that looked interesting. The terrain was rough, but I enjoyed that. It felt like real exploring, not just a casual walk in the woods. At some point, I found myself climbing between two large rock formations. It was a tight space, shaded from the sun, and something caught my eye on the ground. At first, I thought it was just more buffalo dung. Those were everywhere out there, dried up and scattered along the trails. But this wasn't buffalo. The shape was different. The size was smaller, but still large enough to catch my attention. It was fresh. Mountain lion. A cold wave went through me. I immediately felt that same unmistakable sense of being watched. My heart started pounding as I realized how exposed I was. I was in a tight space between rocks, with no clear way to see what was above or around me. If a mountain lion was nearby, I was in a bad position. I had no weapon, no protection, and no easy escape. I turned around and made my way back down, fast but careful. Every instinct told me not to run. Running could trigger a predator's instinct to chase. I kept my eyes moving, checking every ledge, every shadow, every high point where something could be watching. The feeling didn't go away. It stayed with me the entire way down. As I reached the lower part of the trail, I passed by a small pond near the trailhead. The bank was damp from recent rain, and in the mud I saw them, massive paw prints. Fresh, pressed deep into the earth. There was no question about it now. A mountain lion had been nearby, possibly watching me the entire time. I didn't linger. I got to my car, got inside, and locked the doors, even though I knew that wouldn't help if something really wanted to get in. But just like before, the second I was inside, I felt safe again. The feeling of being watched was gone. I started the engine and drove away, heart still racing, mind still replaying every second of the past hour. That was the last time I hiked that area alone. I still love hiking, but after that experience, I take more precautions. I carry protection when I can. I stay more aware of my surroundings, and I trust my instincts. If something doesn't feel right, I don't push my luck. Because sometimes, that feeling isn't just paranoia. Sometimes it's a warning. I hike alone at night. Not always, but often enough that it feels normal to me. My dog is my only company. I like the solitude, the way the world feels different when it's dark and quiet. That night was cold, crisp. The kind of cold that makes the ground hard and dry, that turns breath into small clouds. The sky was clear, and the moon was full, bright enough to cast shadows. I had been hiking for a couple of hours, making my way up a familiar mountain trail. The incline was steady but manageable. I moved carefully, avoiding loose rocks, listening to the occasional rustle of small creatures in the brush. My dog trotted ahead, his ears twitching, always aware of things I couldn't see. I trusted him. If he wasn't concerned, neither was I. I don't use a headlamp when I hike at night. The moon is enough, and I don't want to be seen. Not because I'm doing anything wrong, just because I prefer it that way. There's something about being unnoticed in the darkness that makes me feel safer, like I'm a part of the night rather than an intruder in it. I avoid wooded areas, where the shadows are too deep, where the sounds change, where the dark is heavier. I stick to open spaces, where the sky is vast and the moonlight touches everything. That night, I had stopped to take a picture of the moon. It was surrounded by a halo, a perfect ring of light caused by ice crystals in the upper atmosphere. It was beautiful. I pulled out my phone, aimed it at the sky. The flash went off. I hadn't meant for it to. I never used the flash. The burst of light was jarring, unnatural against the soft glow of the moon. I frowned, checked my settings. The flash was off. Strange. I put my phone away and kept walking. A while later, I heard something, running steps. Fast. Urgent. The sound carried through the night, sharp against the quiet. Then a light appeared, bouncing unsteadily, moving toward me. A headlamp. Someone was running in my direction. I stopped. My dog stopped. I stood still, watching, waiting. The runner came closer. I could see him now, a man in a t-shirt and shorts. He was moving quickly, but not easily. His strides were uneven. I could hear his breathing, ragged and desperate. He slowed when he saw me. Staggered. Stopped. He was panting, his breath coming out in harsh gasps. He looked at me, wide-eyed, chest heaving. His skin was pale, almost colorless in the moonlight. He was shivering violently, his arms wrapped around himself. I understood immediately. He was lost. He was underdressed for the temperature, had likely been running for hours just to stay warm. If he stopped, hypothermia would set in quickly. He had seen my flash. Somewhere in the vast darkness of the mountains, he had seen that single moment of light, and he had run toward me. I motioned for him to follow me. He fell into step beside me, still shaking, still breathing hard. I didn't speak. He didn't either. But he kept moving. That was the important thing. The descent took time. The cold had drained his strength. He stumbled often, but I slowed my pace, adjusted for him. My dog walked ahead, leading the way. The only sounds were our footsteps on the hard earth, his breath still uneven, the faint rustling of the wind through dry grass. The air smelled of frost and distant pine. As we moved lower, the temperature rose slightly. The cold was still sharp, but less biting. The trail leveled out, became easier to navigate. I could hear the distant hum of the highway. We were getting close. Then, finally, his car. A dark shape against the pale gravel of the parking area. He fumbled for his keys, hands shaking too much to work properly. He leaned against the car for support, took deep breaths, trying to steady himself. His headlamp cast strange shadows as he moved. It was only then that he seemed to really see me. He straightened slightly, looked at me, at my dog, then back at me. Something in his expression shifted. Realization, maybe. He had been lost, freezing, on the verge of collapse. And then, out of the darkness, a flash of light. A woman, standing silently in the night with a dog, leading him to safety. And now, she was turning away, heading back into the mountains, as if she had never been there at all. I saw the moment the thought crossed his mind. The way he hesitated, as if trying to decide if this had actually happened, or if he had imagined it in his exhaustion. He said something then, his voice hoarse, but I didn't quite catch it. I nodded once, then turned and walked away. The mountains swallowed me again. The darkness closed in. The cold settled against my skin. My dog moved beside me, silent and sure. Somewhere behind me, an engine started. Headlights cut through the night, then disappeared. And I kept walking. I woke up early that morning, earlier than I normally do, feeling an odd sense of restlessness. It wasn't anxiety, exactly, but I had the urge to get outside, to move, to do something that would tire me out. The weather was less than ideal. Gray clouds hung low, and a light drizzle speckled my window. But I'd hiked in worse. I was used to being alone in the woods, and this particular park was one I'd visited countless times. It was familiar. Safe. I threw on a rain jacket, packed a small backpack with some water, a granola bar, and my pocket knife. Not that I ever expected to need it, and headed out. The drive there was uneventful, the roads slick with rain, the sky a dull, washed-out color. When I pulled into the parking lot, I wasn't surprised to see only one other car, an old silver sedan that looked like it had been there for a while. The park was never busy on days like this. I stepped out of my car and stretched, breathing in the crisp air. The smell of wet earth and pine was thick, one of my favorite scents. The trailhead loomed ahead, the entrance framed by towering trees, their branches weighed down by moisture. I set off at an easy pace, the damp leaves muffling my steps. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. Normally, even in bad weather, I'd hear birds, the rustle of small animals, the occasional crack of a branch as a deer moved through the underbrush. But today, nothing. Just the distant patter of rain on leaves, and the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was just the weather. Animals hunkered down in the rain, after all. But about a mile in, something changed. It was subtle at first, an uneasy feeling creeping in at the edges of my mind. The kind of feeling you get when someone is watching you. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold, nervous energy settled deep in my stomach. I kept walking, trying to shake it off, but with every step, the feeling got worse. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way the trees seemed to close in around me, the way the shadows looked just a little too deep, a little too dark. The air itself felt heavier, pressing in on me from all sides. I stopped and listened. Still nothing. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of birds. Just silence. Thick, suffocating silence. My pulse quickened, but I still had no reason to be afraid. I'd been here dozens of times. I knew these trails. There were no large predators in the area, nothing that should be making me feel like this. But my body didn't care about logic. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and leave. Now, I stood there for a long moment, my breathing shallow, my fingers clenched around the straps of my backpack. I scanned the trees, the trail ahead, the bushes to my sides. Nothing moved, and yet I felt it. Felt something. A presence, just beyond my line of sight. Watching. Waiting. My skin prickled, and suddenly, I couldn't take another step forward. It wasn't fear of what I could see, it was fear of what I couldn't. I turned on my heel and started walking back the way I came. Not running. Running would mean I had a reason to run, and I didn't, not yet. I forced myself to keep a steady pace, my ears straining for any sound, any sign that I wasn't alone. A few minutes passed. Then something cracked behind me. I froze. It wasn't a small noise. It wasn't the sound of a twig snapping under the weight of a falling raindrop. It was deliberate. Heavy. I turned my head just slightly, my eyes darting over my shoulder. Nothing. But the feeling was worse now, so much worse. It was unbearable, pressing down on me like a weight, making my chest tight and my hands shake. I picked up my pace, walking faster, my breath coming quicker. I didn't dare look back again. Then, ahead of me on the trail, movement. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I nearly stumbled. A shape, partially hidden behind a tree. Tall. Still. Watching. I didn't think. I just ran. Branches whipped at my face, my feet slipping on the wet ground as I sprinted down the trail. The parking lot felt miles away, my lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I burst out of the trees and into the clearing where my car sat waiting. Without hesitation, I yanked open the door, threw myself inside, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, my chest heaving, my hands still gripping the wheel like a vice. I don't know what I saw. I don't know if I saw anything at all. But something was out there that day, something that sent every instinct in my body into overdrive. I haven't been back to that park since. I always liked taking my dogs for a walk around the lake in the late afternoon. It was a quiet, familiar trail, a 3-mile loop that wrapped around the water, lined with tall pines and thick underbrush. The ground was packed dirt, well-trodden, with occasional wooden bridges over inlets where the lake reached into the forest. Most of the time, I saw the same handful of people, other dog walkers, joggers, an older couple who fished from the same spot every weekend. It was peaceful, predictable. That day, the air was crisp with the first real bite of fall. Leaves had started to turn, and the wind sent them skittering across the path. My black lab, Toby, trotted beside me with the steady confidence he always had. He was a big dog, built solid, and rarely reacted to anything unless it truly warranted his attention. My golden retriever, Max, was the opposite. Constantly distracted, nose buried in the leaves, tail wagging at every new smell. He was friendly to a fault, always looking for someone to greet. We had made it about halfway around the loop when I saw the jogger. He was coming from the opposite direction, moving at a steady pace but slowing as he neared me. Something about the way he approached made me uneasy before he even opened his mouth. His run wasn't smooth. His arms were too stiff, his stride awkward, as if he was too focused on something else. When he got close enough, he slowed to a stop, breathing just a little too hard for someone who should have been in a jogging rhythm. "Hey," he said, glancing around like he was making sure no one else was nearby. I think I got turned around. "Where's the parking lot?" I frowned. The question didn't make sense. It was a loop. There was only one main parking lot, and no matter which direction he went, he'd end up there. I pointed down the trail. "You can go either way. It's a loop, so if you keep walking, you'll get there." He didn't nod or react like someone who just got the answer they were looking for. Instead, he stared at me for a beat too long, then asked again, "Yeah, but which way is the fastest?" I hesitated, feeling an edge of irritation now. "It's the same either way." He stepped an inch closer. "So, you're saying if I go that way," he jerked his chin in the direction I'd come from, "I'll reach the parking lot?" I nodded, my grip tightening slightly on Toby's leash. My lab hadn't moved an inch since the guy stopped me, which wasn't unusual, but something about his stillness felt different. His head was high, his ears slightly back, body rigid. Max, oblivious, had started sniffing around in the leaves, uninterested in the conversation. The jogger took another small step forward. "And if I go the other way?" Something in my gut twisted. He wasn't confused. He wasn't lost. He was stalling. Testing. "It's a loop," I said again, voice flatter now. "Just keep going." That's when Toby growled. It was low and deep, vibrating through the leash into my hand. It wasn't the kind of growl dogs make when they're playing or mildly annoyed. This was a warning, one that meant business. I had never heard Toby make a sound like that before, not once in his life. The jogger froze. His eyes flicked to Toby, and for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression. He hadn't been nervous before, but now he was. Slowly, he raised his hands in the universal "I'm not a threat" gesture, took a step back, then another. And then, without another word, he turned and ran. Not jogged, ran. Fast. Too fast for someone who had supposedly been tired and lost a minute ago. I stood there, pulse hammering, staring after him. My body hadn't caught up with what my instincts already knew. Something was wrong with that man. He had pushed too hard, ignored my answers, and kept stepping into my space. He hadn't been just a lost jogger. My mind scrambled over the details. He wasn't carrying a phone, wasn't wearing any earbuds, no watch on his wrist. He had no water, no gear, nothing but a pair of running shoes and shorts, despite the chilly weather. And the way he'd looked at me, no, not at me, at my dogs, measuring, calculating. He had been sizing up the situation. I turned in the opposite direction and started walking quickly, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. My ears strained for any sound of footsteps, any sign that he had doubled back. The wind rustled the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out. Otherwise, silence. I walked faster. Toby stayed alert beside me, his usual relaxed demeanor gone. Every so often, he'd glance behind us, ears flicking back. Max, finally catching on to the tension, stuck closer to my side. By the time I reached the parking lot, my chest was tight with nerves. My car sat where I had left it, nothing out of place. I hurried the dogs inside, locking the doors as soon as they were in. Only then did I sit there for a second, gripping the steering wheel, letting out a shaky breath. I reached down and scratched behind Toby's ears. "Good boy." My voice was barely above a whisper. He sat there, steady, unshaken, eyes still on the trail. That was the first time I had ever heard him growl. And that, more than anything, was what stuck with me the most. Because whatever that jogger had planned, Toby had known it before I did. And I don't want to think about what might have happened if he hadn't been there. Hiking alone had always been my escape. There was something about the solitude, the silence, the complete detachment from the noise of everyday life that I craved. I had done solo hikes before, long treks through mountains and forests, always trusting my instincts and my preparation. This trip was supposed to be the same. A remote canyon in Utah, deep in the desert, untouched and rarely traveled. I had spent weeks researching it, poring over maps, reading old hiking forums, gathering what little information was available. There were no official trails, no park rangers, no designated campsites. Just open, empty land. The kind of place where you could walk for miles and never see another human being. That's exactly what I wanted. I arrived early in the morning, my car bouncing over miles of rough dirt roads. The last sign of civilization had been nearly an hour ago, just a faded gas station where I topped off my tank. Now it was just me and the landscape, miles of barren rock, rising cliffs, and dry riverbeds stretching endlessly into the distance. I parked at a small pull-off near the edge of the canyon. There were no signs, no markers, nothing to indicate that anyone had ever hiked here before. Perfect. I shouldered my pack and began my descent. The canyon walls loomed around me, curving in smooth, wind-carved patterns. It was breathtaking in its stillness. Even my footsteps barely made a sound on the packed dirt. I felt completely alone. By midday, I had reached the dry riverbed at the canyon floor. The old wash snaked through the valley, its cracked surface marked only by the occasional animal track. I followed it, knowing it would lead me deeper into the canyon's heart. The sun was relentless, beating down on the rock around me. I found shade beneath an overhanging ledge and stopped for water and a quick meal. That's when I saw it, a single footprint in the dirt. At first, I felt relieved. It meant someone else had been here, another hiker, maybe. But as I looked closer, unease settled in my stomach. The print wasn't heading in any particular direction. It didn't cross my path or lead away. It was just there, in the middle of the wash. Alone. I scanned the ground around it, but there were no other prints. No signs of approach or departure. Just that one perfect mark. I told myself it was old, maybe partially erased by the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I pressed on. The canyon walls tightened as I walked, rising higher, the space between them narrowing. The sky above was just a thin ribbon now. It was the kind of place where sound should echo, but my footsteps felt swallowed by the silence. By late afternoon, I found a flat, sheltered spot near a boulder and set up camp. I built a small fire, even though I didn't need it for warmth. Something about the place made me want the comfort of flames. I ate quickly, the quiet pressing in on me. The stars appeared overhead, sharp and clear in the desert sky. I let my eyes close, listening to the distant crackle of the fire. Sometime later, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the rock. The air was still. Then I heard it. A scream. Distant, but unmistakably human. It echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the stone. Long drawn out. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't sound like the wind. Then it came again. Closer. My stomach nodded. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but rock and empty space. The scream faded, leaving only silence. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, my back pressed against the boulder, knife in hand, waiting. But nothing else came. By morning, the canyon felt normal again. Sunlight filtered through the rock, filling the space with warmth. The fear from the night before felt distant, almost ridiculous. I packed quickly and started hiking, putting as much distance between me and that campsite as possible. An hour later, I saw another footprint. This one was fresh, and it was behind mine. I stopped cold, my breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly, scanning the canyon walls, the dry riverbed, the narrow passages of rock. Nothing, but someone had been following me. I moved faster, heart pounding, every muscle on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see movement, but the canyon remained empty. For the next few hours, I saw no more footprints, no signs of life. But the feeling never left me, that crawling sensation on the back of my neck, the certainty that I wasn't alone. By late afternoon, I reached the narrowest part of the canyon, a tight passage where the walls closed in on either side, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. I hesitated. Something about it made my skin crawl, but there was no other way forward. I took a breath and stepped inside. The rock pressed in around me, the light dimming. I moved quickly, my footsteps muffled by the stone. Halfway through, I heard it. A whisper. Right behind me. I spun, my knife raised. There was nothing there. The passage was empty. I didn't wait. I ran. I burst out into the open canyon, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking. I didn't stop moving. I hiked without rest, pushing myself long past exhaustion, until I finally saw the edge of the canyon, the place where I had parked. Relief hit me like a wave. But as I reached my car, something made me turn. And that's when I saw them. Fresh footprints, leading right up to where I had parked. But there were no footprints leading away. I didn't hesitate. I threw my pack in the car, started the engine, and sped away, dust kicking up behind me. I didn't look back. I don't know who, or what, was in that canyon with me. And I don't want to find out. I had always considered myself an experienced hiker. I'd tackled remote trails in Montana, camped solo in the Sierras, and even spent a few nights alone in the backcountry of Alaska. I knew how to read a map, use a compass, and handle myself in the wilderness. So when a friend mentioned a lesser-known trail in the Smoky Mountains that led to an abandoned fire tower with an incredible view, I jumped at the opportunity. The trail wasn't marked on most maps, and according to my friend, only a handful of people knew about it. It's a little overgrown, he had warned, but it's worth it. Just make sure you follow your GPS. That should have been my first red flag. I set out early in the morning, my pack loaded with enough supplies for an overnight trip. The first few miles were relatively easy, though the trail was narrower and more rugged than I had expected. Thick tree roots snaked across the ground, and sections of the path had been washed out by recent rains, but I pressed on, confident in my navigation skills. As the day wore on, the trail became harder to follow. Overgrown brush clawed at my legs, and fallen trees forced me to detour more than once. Still, my GPS showed I was on track, so I wasn't too concerned. I figured I'd make it to the fire tower by late afternoon, set up camp, and enjoy the sunset from the top. But then, something strange happened. I was about 5 hours into my hike when the trail simply disappeared. One moment, I was following a faint but visible path. The next, I was staring at an unbroken wall of trees and undergrowth. I pulled out my GPS. The screen still showed a route ahead, but no matter which direction I looked, there was no sign of a trail. I tried to remain calm. Maybe I had veered slightly off course. I backtracked about 20 feet, but the path behind me had become just as unclear as what lay ahead. It was as if the forest had swallowed the trail while I wasn't looking. I took a deep breath and decided to bushwhack my way forward, relying on my GPS to guide me. I pushed through thick ferns and tangled branches, my pace slowing as the undergrowth thickened. Minutes turned to an hour, and still, there was no sign of the fire tower or even a clear direction. Then, my GPS screen froze. I tapped it, shook it, even restarted it. Nothing. The map remained stuck, and my location marker refused to update. Frustrated, I pulled out my compass, but something was off. The needle spun lazily, refusing to settle on north. A cold wave of unease rolled over me. I wasn't lost. I couldn't be. I had been following the route. But the tools I relied on were suddenly useless, and the forest around me had no landmarks, no defining features. Just endless trees, stretching in every direction. I decided to turn back. At the very least, I could return to my last known location and reassess. But after walking for what felt like an hour, nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed identical, and there were no signs of my previous passage, no broken branches, no footprints in the soft earth. Panic began to creep in. I stopped and forced myself to think rationally. The sun was still high, and I had enough food and water to last a couple of days if necessary. I wasn't in immediate danger. I just needed to stay calm and find my way out. That's when I heard the first sound. A twig snapping. I wasn't moving. I hadn't stepped on anything. But something, or someone had. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. The dense foliage made it impossible to see more than 20 feet in any direction. But I felt something. A presence. The kind of feeling you get when someone is watching you. "Hello," I called out. Silence. I strained to listen, but the forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, oppressive stillness. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just an animal. A deer, a fox, something harmless. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had spent enough time in the wilderness to know the normal sounds of the forest. This wasn't normal. I picked up my pace, trying to move as quickly and quietly as possible. Every few minutes, I paused to listen. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to fade. I knew I needed to set up camp before nightfall. I found a small clearing and hurriedly pitched my tent, keeping my knife close at hand. I ate a small meal, but my appetite was gone. The silence was suffocating. Then, just as I was about to crawl into my tent, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They circled my campsite, just beyond the ring of trees. I held my breath, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Who's there?" I forced out, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Slowly, the adrenaline faded, and exhaustion took over. I sat against a tree, my knife still in hand, and at some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was morning. The forest was quiet, but the sense of unease hadn't left. I quickly packed up my gear and started walking. I didn't care if I had to hike all day. I just wanted out. About an hour into my trek, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not mine. Not an animal's. They were deep, human, and followed my exact route from the night before. They led right up to where I had slept, then disappeared. I didn't run. I wanted to, but I forced myself to keep moving at a steady pace. If someone was out there, I didn't want them to know I was panicking. By midday, the forest started to thin. Then, suddenly, I stumbled onto a marked trail. Relief flooded me. I followed it for what felt like forever until I finally saw the parking lot where I had left my car. As I loaded my pack into the trunk, I glanced back at the trail. That's when I saw them. Fresh footprints, leading right up to where I had parked, but never leaving. I got in my car and drove without stopping. I never went back to that part of the Smokies, and I never told my friend what had happened. because the scariest part wasn't that I had gotten lost. It was that I wasn't alone.